The void between universes held no concept of time. In this non-space where dimensions folded upon themselves like origami constructed by blind gods, a tear opened without ceremony or warning. It began as a pinprick of wrongness, a mathematical impossibility that quantum physics would have rejected outright had there been anyone present to observe it. Beerus had been sleeping. The god of destruction of Universe 7 rested on his planet in a state approaching death, his vital signs reduced to the barest minimum necessary for existence. This was not unusual. Beerus had perfected the art of prolonged slumber over millions of years, treating consciousness as an occasional inconvenience rather than a default state. His planet orbited a dying star in a forgotten corner of Universe 7, chosen specifically for its distance from anything that might disturb his rest. The orbital mechanics of his world followed patterns established before most civilizations had learned to harness fire. The atmosphere filtered light to a perpetual twilight purple, and the temperature remained constant within a range that would have seemed tropical to most carbon-based life forms. Whis, his attendant and martial arts master, had departed 3 standard rotations prior on business Beerus neither understood nor cared to investigate. Something about temporal anomalies in Universe 6. The details had washed over Beerus like water over stone. The dimensional rupture began in the upper atmosphere, invisible to conventional sensors. Reality itself contracted, compressed by forces that operated on principles Universe 7 had never been designed to accommodate. The fabric of space-time, normally flexible enough to accommodate the passage of gods and mortals alike, suddenly found itself unable to stretch any further. Beerus stirred. His feline features twitched as the first tremors of the rupture reached his consciousness. In his current state, approaching the 43rd year of a projected 50-year hibernation cycle, even his divine awareness operated at reduced capacity. The sensation that penetrated his sleep felt wrong in a way his mind struggled to categorize. Not danger precisely, not pain, simply wrong. The tear widened. What had been a microscopic flaw in the cosmic weave expanded to encompass his planet's magnetosphere. Energy, the color of nothing human eyes could perceive, leaked through the gap, carrying with it the scent of other universes, other rules, other gods. Beerus's eyes snapped open. The vertical pupils contracted to slits as his brain, still sluggish from prolonged dormancy, attempted to process what his instincts were screaming. He sat up from his cushioned rest, his thin frame moving with the fluid grace of a predator despite his disorientation. His clothing, simple and practical, remained undisturbed by the growing chaos above. The rupture achieved critical mass, the forces holding it in check. Whatever cosmic law enforcement might exist at such fundamental levels failed catastrophically. Reality inverted. Beerus found himself yanked upward as if gravity had reversed polarity, his planet receding below him at speeds that turned it into a purple dot, then a speck, then nothing. He didn't scream. Screaming implied surprise or fear, and Beerus possessed neither in sufficient quantities to waste energy on vocalization. Instead, his face settled into an expression of profound irritation. His tail lashed once, twice, then went rigid as the dimensional forces compressed his physical form to pass through barriers never meant to be crossed. The journey through the interdimensional gap lasted either no time at all or several eternities, depending on which frame of reference one chose to adopt. For Beerus, it felt like being forced through a space barely wide enough to accommodate his smallest atom, while simultaneously being stretched across distances that made galactic measurements seem quaint. His destructive energy, normally kept at a low simmer during rest periods, flared involuntarily as his body's defense mechanisms activated. The transition completed with the same lack of ceremony that had characterized its beginning. One moment, Beerus existed in the crushing non-space between dimensions. The next, he materialized in a region of space that followed rules he didn't recognize. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of his home planet, but an aggressive emptiness that seemed to push back against his very existence. The stars here burned in configurations his mind rejected as impossible. Their light arrived at wavelengths that made his eyes water. The background radiation of this space carried harmonics that grated against his divine nature like sandpaper against silk. Beerus floated in the void, his body automatically adjusting to the new environment. His destructive energy, still elevated from the forced transition, pulsed outward in waves. Each pulse traveled several light years before dissipating, announcing his presence to anything capable of sensing such things. His mood, already soured by the interrupted sleep, curdled into something approaching genuine anger. 43 years of rest ruined. Was absent when actually needed. And now this bizarre universe that felt wrong in every measurable way. The anger needed an outlet. Beerus was not introspective enough to redirect his emotions into productive contemplation, nor patient enough to simply wait for understanding to arrive. He was a god who had destroyed countless civilizations for offenses ranging from poor cuisine to excessive noise. An interrupted nap rated far higher on his personal scale of unforgivable sins. His eyes still adjusting to the strange starlight focused on the nearest celestial bodies. 2 planets orbited a red giant several light years distant. Sensors more sophisticated than anything mortal science could produce told him these worlds were barren, their surfaces scoured clean by radiation over geological timescales. No life, no witnesses. Perfect. Beerus raised his right hand, the gesture almost casual. His destructive energy coalesced at his fingertips, forming a sphere of purple-black power that drank in the surrounding light. The sphere compressed, became denser, began to rotate. When it had accumulated sufficient mass, roughly equivalent to that of a small moon, Beerus flicked it forward with his index finger. The sphere crossed the distance in subjective seconds, traveling at speeds that violated several supposed universal constants. It struck the first planet dead center, penetrating the crust, with the ease of a bullet through wet paper. For a heartbeat, nothing appeared to happen. Then the planet came apart. Not exploded, not shattered, but simply ceased to exist as a coherent celestial body. The destructive energy converted matter directly into nothing, unmaking atomic bonds and erasing the fundamental particles from existence. The process propagated outward in a sphere consuming the planet's mass faster than light could travel through its interior. Within 3 seconds, where there had been a rocky world larger than Jupiter, there remained only an expanding cloud of particles too small to be measured by conventional instruments. The debris field would, given several million years, potentially coalesce into a new planetary body. More likely, the red giant would capture the scattered matter and consume it. The second planet followed 30 seconds later. Beerus didn't bother with a different technique. The same casual flick, the same sphere of annihilation, the same absolute erasure. 2 worlds that had orbited their star for 4 billion years ceased to exist because a god had been inconvenienced. The destruction brought no satisfaction. If anything, Beerus felt more irritated than before. The act of planetary destruction usually carried a certain aesthetic pleasure, a confirmation of his role and power. Here in this wrong universe, with its wrong stars and wrong physics, even annihilation felt hollow. He floated in the void, tail twitching with feline irritation, and expanded his senses. His Kai perception, honed over millions of years, swept outward in all directions simultaneously. In Universe 7, This technique would have provided him with a complete tactical map of every significant power source within several galaxies. Here the information returned garbled and confused. There were powers in this universe, vast ones, but they operated on principles his senses struggled to interpret. Something dark and cold and calculating, radiating malevolence from an unimaginable distance. Something else that defied categorization, entirely operating on principles his senses couldn't translate into familiar terms. And closer, much closer, something that felt almost familiar. A concentration of life and energy and chaos that reminded him faintly of Earth. Not his Earth, not the world where Goku and Vegeta trained and fought and occasionally inconvenienced him. But similar enough to register as interesting, similar enough to investigate. Beerus oriented himself toward the energy signature. The distance was considerable by mortal standards, perhaps several thousand light-years. For him, it represented a journey of minutes rather than millennia. He didn't accelerate gradually. One moment he hung motionless in space. The next he was traveling at velocities that would have required entirely new categories of measurement to describe accurately. The stars stretched past him in streaks of distorted light. Space itself warped around his passage, unable to fully accommodate the presence of a divine being moving at such speeds. His destructive energy, still elevated from his earlier tantrum, left a trail of disrupted physics in his wake. Atoms that came too close to his aura simply vanished. Dust particles ceased to exist. The hard vacuum of space, empty by mortal standards, was still far too crowded for something of his nature moving at such velocity. As he traveled, his instincts registered wrongness without understanding why. The universe operated differently here, though Beerus possessed neither the vocabulary nor the interest to articulate how. Gravity felt off. Light moved strangely. Even the vacuum of space had a different texture against his aura. These weren't observations born from analysis, but visceral reactions, the way a cat knows when a room has been rearranged, even in total darkness. Most concerning, though he would never have articulated it as such, was the complete absence of divine ki. In Universe 7, even the most remote corners of space carried traces of the gods who maintained cosmic order. The Supreme Kais left subtle fingerprints on reality itself. Other destroyers, though distant, could be sensed if one knew where to look. Xeno's presence hung over everything, like an invisible sun impossible to ignore, for those with the perception to feel it. Here, nothing. Or rather different signatures that his mind couldn't properly categorize. Not gods as he understood them, but something else. Something that made his tail bristle with an instinct he rarely experienced. Beerus pushed the thought aside. He had not survived millions of years as a god of destruction by overthinking situations. When in doubt, destroy first and contemplate the philosophical implications later. If anything in this universe objected to his presence strongly enough to matter, he would sense it. And if he couldn't sense it, it probably wasn't worth worrying about. The journey continued. Time lost meaning at such velocities. Beerus passed through stellar nurseries where new stars coalesced from clouds of gas and dust. He skirted the edges of black holes that bent space-time into knots. He threaded through asteroid fields and nebulae without conscious thought, his body moving on autopilot, while his mind remained focused on the growing energy signature ahead. The planet, when it finally came into view, appeared blue and green and white from a distance. Oceans, continents, clouds. The basic template of a living world familiar enough to trigger recognition, despite the wrongness that permeated everything else. Satellites orbited in patterns that suggested technological civilization. Energy signatures scattered across the surface indicated cities' power generation, organized society. Beerus slowed his approach, though not from caution. The transition from faster-than-light to conventional speeds required no particular effort, but the physics of this universe seemed to resist the change in ways he found irritating. Space itself appeared to have opinions about proper deceleration rates. He entered the planet's orbit at a point approximately 22,000 miles above the equator. From this vantage, he could observe the full sphere of the world, watching it rotate beneath him with the stately patience of celestial mechanics. Continents drifted past. Weather systems swirled in familiar patterns. The Terminator line between day and night crept across the surface as the planet turned. The energy signatures resolved into greater detail at this range. Thousands of individual power sources, most barely worth noticing, a handful that registered as potentially interesting, and several that possessed enough strength to qualify as actual warriors by his standards, though still far beneath anything that might challenge him. Beerus's mood had not improved during the journey. The interrupted sleep still rankled. The destroyed planets had provided no catharsis, and now this world, similar enough to Earth to remind him of home, but different enough to emphasize his displacement, rotated beneath him with infuriating indifference to his presence. His tail lashed once hard enough to create a shockwave that rippled through local space. Several satellites in his immediate vicinity ceased functioning as their circuitry overloaded from the proximity to his energy. He noticed this dimly, filed it away as irrelevant, and continued his observation. The planet would have food. Of this Beerus felt reasonably certain. Living worlds developed cuisine. Sometimes the food proved exceptional, worthy of sparing civilizations that would otherwise have warranted destruction. Sometimes it proved disappointing, in which case the civilization had already sealed its fate by failing to develop proper culinary arts. But first, before investigating restaurants, or threatening inhabitants, or doing anything that might be classified as productive, Beerus needed to determine the power structure of this world. Who ruled here? What gods or governments or galactic empires claimed ownership? More importantly, would anyone object if he simply took what he wanted? The questions were rhetorical. Beerus didn't actually care about the answers. If someone objected to his presence with sufficient force to annoy him, he would destroy them. If they objected without sufficient force, he would destroy them anyway, possibly after eating whatever food they could provide. And if they didn't object at all, well, that would save time. His energy leaking from his form, in a constant low-level aura, began to interact with the planet's magnetic field. The effect was subtle, at first barely measurable fluctuations in the ionosphere. But as Beerus settled into a stable orbit and his unconscious irritation continued to manifest as destructive power, the fluctuations grew stronger. Below on the surface, sensitive instruments began to register anomalies. Satellites that had survived his initial arrival started transmitting warning signals. Defense networks activated. And in various locations around the globe, individuals with the power or technology to sense such things turned their attention skyward. Beerus noticed none of this. He was too busy being annoyed about the quality of his nap, the absence of whis, and the general wrongness of this entire universe. The planet could wait a few more minutes while he decided whether destroying it immediately would improve his mood or simply waste energy better spent on finding food. His eyes adapted to pierce through stellar coronas and perceive wavelengths invisible to mortal senses focused on the largest concentration of life signatures. A city sprawling and dense, built around architectural styles that seemed to favor height over width. Interesting. Possibly worth investigating before the inevitable destruction. Beerus yawned, revealing fangs that had torn through substances harder than neutronium. The yawn released a small burst of destructive energy that flash vaporized 3 more satellites. He noticed this time, but only because the explosions briefly interrupted his view of the city below. The interruption did not improve his mood. Far below, the planet's defenders scrambled to respond to a threat they didn't yet understand. And in the void of space, a god of destruction, who had just been forcibly relocated to an unfamiliar universe, considered whether to visit the city first or simply erase it from orbit and save himself the trouble of social interaction. The decision, like most of Beerus's choices, would come down to whim rather than reason. And whatever conclusion he reached, an entire world would have to live with the consequences. Or die with them. Beerus's tail swished once more, a gesture that, in a house cat, would have indicated mild irritation. In a deity capable of erasing planets with a thought, it represented something rather more ominous. The planet rotated beneath him, unaware that its continued existence now depended entirely on whether a bored god decided food was worth the effort of not destroying everything immediately. Beerus hung in the void. Above the planet, his tail swaying, with the irregular rhythm of mounting irritation. The destruction of two barren worlds had accomplished nothing beyond wasting a few seconds of his time. His mood remained sour, his sleep remained interrupted, and this strange universe continued to exist in defiance of his preference that it not. He extended his senses again this time, with more deliberation than the reflexive scan he had performed earlier. His kai expanded outward in a wave that would have been invisible to mortal perception, but registered on instruments sensitive enough to detect gravitational fluctuations. The energy rippled through space at velocities that treated light speed as a suggestion rather than a law. The wave encountered the first star system within seconds. Gas giants and rocky planets orbited their sun in patterns dictated by gravity and momentum. Nothing unusual, nothing worth noting. The key wave passed through without slowing, treating the entire system as transparent. The second system, 17 light-years distant, contained a civilization. Beerus's senses registered the electromagnetic noise, first radio waves and microwave transmissions bouncing between planets and stations. Then came the energy signatures of industry fusion reactors and antimatter containment fields and technologies that would have seemed miraculous to less advanced species. The civilization possessed interplanetary capability, but had not yet achieved faster-than-light travel. Interesting perhaps, but not relevant to his current situation. The wave continued its expansion, sweeping through stellar neighborhoods and dust clouds and empty spaces between galaxies. Each location it touched provided Beerus with information he didn't particularly want, but absorbed anyway through sheer proximity. Civilizations rose and fell within his expanding sphere of awareness. Wars raged on planets whose names he would never learn. Stars collapsed into neutron remnants, while others ignited from accumulated gas. And through it all, Beerus felt the absence like a missing tooth. In Universe 7, divine energy permeated everything. The Supreme Kais had touched creation itself, leaving fingerprints that could be detected by those with sufficient sensitivity. Other gods of destruction, those separated by vast distances and the conventions that kept them from interfering with each other's universes, nonetheless produced ripples in the cosmic fabric. Even Zeno the Omni-King, whose power exceeded categorization, made his presence known through the simple fact of existence. Here nothing. Or rather something so fundamentally different that Beerus's senses classified it as absence. The universe operated according to rules that had never heard of supreme Kais or angels, or the delicate balance between creation and destruction. It was like walking into a room where gravity pointed sideways and being expected to pretend this was normal. The realization did not improve his mood. His Kai wave reached its maximum effective range approximately 2,000 light-years from his current position before beginning to dissipate. The information it returned painted a picture of a universe teeming with life and energy and conflict. but organized along principles that made no sense to his divine nature. No Kai energy, no destroyer signatures, no angel oversight, just chaos and order and everything in between, held together by forces he couldn't name. Beerus's eyes narrowed. His tail, previously swaying with irritation, went still. The blue and green planet below continued its rotation, oblivious to the fact that it had just become significantly more interesting through the sheer novelty of being the only familiar thing in an unfamiliar cosmos. The dark energy he had detected earlier remained at the edge of his perception, too distant for detailed analysis, but close enough to register as a persistent itch. It reminded him vaguely of Frieza's energy signature, though magnified and twisted into something that operated on a larger scale. Not evil precisely. Malevolence implied passion, and this felt more like the cold calculation of mathematics made manifest. Destruction without anger, domination without desire. Simply the logical conclusion of power applied without restraint. Beerus filed this information away under potentially annoying, and returned his attention to the planet below. Whatever the dark energy represented, it was far enough away to not be an immediate concern. The planet, meanwhile, was right here, rotating smugly beneath him, with its oceans and continents, and the promise of food. The thought triggered a sensation Beerus hadn't felt since being yanked across dimensional barriers. Hunger, not the desperate need of starvation, but the gourmand's desire for interesting flavors and novel textures. In Universe 7, he had spent decades sampling cuisine from countless worlds, destroying those that disappointed him and sparing those that produced dishes worthy of his palate. This planet, if it followed patterns similar to Earth, would possess restaurants and chefs and the entire infrastructure of culinary arts. Unless it didn't. Unless this universe had somehow produced a version of Earth where food was bland, or worse, non-existent. The possibility made his tail resume its irritated swaying. The planet's energy signatures resolved into greater detail as he focused his attention. The largest concentration of life existed on the land masses clustered into dense nodes that suggested cities. Millions of individual power levels, most barely registering above the background noise. Thousands that achieved what might pass for noteworthy in mortal terms. Dozens that actually qualified as meaningful by his standards. And several that made him pause. One signature blazed from a city on the eastern continent, radiating energy that would have made it notable even in Universe 7. Not God level, not even close, but substantially stronger than most beings Beerus had encountered in the lower realms. The power felt strange, almost familiar in its wrongness. Solar radiation somehow internalized and metabolized into strength. Unusual. Potentially interesting. Another signature, this one from the same general region, carried a different quality. Divine heritage, though not from any god Beerus recognized. The energy suggested mythology made flesh ancient power, operating under modern constraints. Female if his senses read the signature correctly, and carrying weapons or artifacts that resonated with magical frequencies. A third signature flickered in and out of his perception, moving at speeds that would have been impossible for most mortals. Not teleportation, but velocity, approaching the kind of thing that broke physics in interesting ways. The energy signature tasted like lightning and possibility, and the fundamental forces of motion made personal. Beerus's interest, previously focused on the abstract question of whether the planet deserved immediate destruction, shifted toward something approaching curiosity. This world possessed defenders. Warriors who might provide entertainment before the inevitable conclusion. The possibility of a fight, something to stretch muscles that had been dormant for decades, held a certain appeal. Not enough appeal to actually seek out combat, of course. Beerus didn't lower himself to hunting for opponents like some common tournament participant. But if these defenders happened to approach him with sufficient rudeness or poor timing, well, that would simply be the natural consequence of their own choices. The decision crystallized with the abruptness characteristic of all his conclusions. He would descend to the planet's surface. He would locate food. And if anyone objected with sufficient force to register as annoying, he would destroy them and then locate food anyway. Simple, efficient, requiring minimal thought or effort. Beerus shifted his position in space, preparing to enter the planet's atmosphere. His energy still elevated from the dimensional transition, and the subsequent planetary destruction began to interact with the magnetic fields protecting the world below. The effect was subtle at first, barely measurable fluctuations that sensitive instruments might detect as anomalies. Then, his patience already worn thin by interrupted sleep and cosmic displacement eroded the remaining margin that separated controlled presence from natural disaster. His aura flared. Not intentionally, not with any conscious desire to cause damage, but simply because maintaining perfect control required effort he wasn't willing to expend. The destructive energy that made up his fundamental nature leaked through his usual restraints, spilling into local space like radiation from an unshielded reactor. The magnetic field of the planet bent, twisted, reorganized itself around the presence of energy that operated on principles its physics had never encountered. Charged particles trapped in the magnetosphere found themselves following new trajectories, spiraling inward toward the upper atmosphere, or escaping into space along field lines that hadn't existed seconds before. 3 satellites in geosynchronous orbit ceased functioning simultaneously. The first, a communications relay, experienced a cascade failure when its circuitry tried to process inputs that exceeded every safety parameter. The second, a weather observation platform, registered temperatures and energy readings so far outside expected values that its software assumed sensor malfunction and shut down all systems. The third simply disintegrated its composite materials, unable to withstand proximity to energy that treated molecular bonds as optional. Beerus noticed none of this. His attention had already moved past the satellites, past the orbital space, focusing now on the point where he would enter the atmosphere. The city with the concentration of power signatures seemed as good a destination as any. Large cities usually possessed better restaurants than smaller settlements. And if the food proved disappointing, the destruction of a major population center might improve his mood where planetary annihilation had failed. He began his descent. The transition from orbit to atmosphere happened over the course of 3 seconds, during which Beerus covered approximately 140 miles while decelerating from orbital velocity to something approaching a casual fall. The physics of this maneuver would have required complex mathematics to describe accurately. Beerus accomplished it through the same unconscious competence that allowed cats to always land on their feet. The upper atmosphere ignited around him. Air molecules encountering his aura underwent transitions that released energy in wavelengths spanning from deep infrared to hard ultraviolet. The result was a luminous trail that carved across the sky like a meteor, except meteors didn't decelerate smoothly or emit energy signatures that made electromagnetic sensors scream in confusion. Below on the planet's surface, warning systems that had been designed to detect nuclear weapons and natural disasters and extraterrestrial threats all activated within the same 5-second window. Military installations went to high alert. Defense networks powered up weapons that had never been fired in anger. And in various locations around the globe, individuals who possessed the ability to sense such things felt the arrival of something that didn't belong. Beerus descended through the stratosphere, then the troposphere, his velocity bleeding off until he hung suspended in the air approximately 20,000 feet above the city. From this altitude, he could observe the entire metropolitan area, watching traffic flow through streets and lights, illuminate buildings as the planet's rotation carried this portion of its surface toward night. The city sprawled across the landscape in patterns that suggested organic growth rather than planned development. Skyscrapers clustered in the center, surrounded by progressively shorter structures that eventually gave way to residential areas. Rivers cut through the urban fabric, spanned by bridges that carried vehicles and pedestrians. Parks and green spaces interrupted the concrete and steel, providing relief from the architectural density. It looked, Beerus thought, with a sensation approaching disappointment, remarkably similar to cities on Earth in Universe 7. The same basic template of civilization repeated across dimensional barriers. Probably the same basic template of food as well, which meant his options would likely include the usual range from exceptional to barely tolerable. His tail swished once, releasing a pulse of destructive energy that flash vaporized a cubic mile of atmosphere. The resulting vacuum collapsed immediately, generating a thunderclap that rattled windows 15 miles below. Beerus noticed the noise, found it mildly irritating, and made a mental note to be more careful with unconscious energy releases. The note lasted approximately 2 seconds before he forgot about it entirely. Below in the city he had chosen as his destination, alarms began to sound, not the conventional sirens used for weather emergencies or civil defense, but deeper tones that indicated situations without precedent. Emergency response protocols activated, evacuation routes opened, and somewhere in the organized chaos of institutional reaction messages began flowing toward individuals who possessed the power and responsibility to respond to threats that exceeded normal human capacity. Beerus observed this activity with the detached interest of a cat watching ants reorganize their nest after someone kicked it. The panic was understandable, he supposed, from the perspective of the beings below. An unknown entity had just entered their atmosphere, radiating enough energy to glass continents. They had no context for his presence, no framework to understand what he represented. They would learn. Either through conversation, if they proved polite and provided good food, or through the universal education of obliteration. Beerus wasn't particular about which method they chose. He descended further, dropping to an altitude of 5,000 feet. The air here was thicker, carrying scents that his enhanced senses analyzed automatically. Combustion byproducts, industrial chemicals, the organic signature of millions of lives packed into close proximity, and faintly, the smell of cooking food drifting up from restaurants and homes. His stomach, which had been dormant during his interrupted sleep cycle, reminded him that it had been 43 years since his last meal. The hunger wasn't urgent, not yet, but it existed as a presence that would grow increasingly difficult to ignore. Better to address it now, while he still possessed the patience to be selective about cuisine, than to wait until hunger made him irritable enough to destroy everything out of spite. Beerus's eyes scanned the city below, searching for concentrations of culinary activity. Restaurant districts, food markets, anywhere that promised variety and quality. His divine senses, usually employed for tracking enemies or assessing threats, now repurposed themselves for the marginally more peaceful task of locating dinner. And found instead the approaching power signatures of beings who had decided that confronting an unknown cosmic entity was preferable to waiting to see what it would do. Beerus's expression, previously neutral with undertones of boredom, shifted into something that resembled annoyance. He hadn't even reached the ground yet, hadn't destroyed anything meaningful, hadn't made demands or issued threats. And already the locals were mobilizing to interfere with what should have been a simple matter of finding food and deciding whether the planet deserved to continue existing. His tail lashed once hard enough to create a visible distortion in the air. The gesture released more destructive energy, a warning to anything sensitive enough to detect it. The meaning was clear enough: approach with caution or don't approach at all. Whether the approaching signatures would heed this warning remained to be seen. Beerus suspected they wouldn't. In his experience, beings powerful enough to sense destructive energy were usually foolish enough to think they could do something about it. The first signature was moving fast, crossing the distance between them, at speeds that would have broken the sound barrier several times over. Solar-powered, his earlier assessment confirmed. Strong by mortal standards, completely inadequate by divine ones. Beerus sighed the exhalation, carrying enough force to scatter clouds in a 3-mile radius. He had wanted food. A simple request, really requiring nothing more than competent cooking and the wisdom to not interrupt him while eating. Instead, he would apparently need to deal with defenders and heroes and whatever other titles these beings gave themselves. The planet rotated beneath him, carrying its cities and oceans and millions of oblivious inhabitants toward an encounter they didn't understand, with a god who had been interrupted during his nap and was finding their universe disappointingly similar to his own in all the wrong ways. Beerus settled into a stable hover, crossing his arms and waiting, with the patience of someone who knew that whatever happened next would ultimately prove irrelevant to the larger question of whether he felt like destroying everything. The Watchtower hung in geosynchronous orbit, 22,300 miles above Earth's equator. A monument to preparedness and the conviction that threats could be anticipated, categorized and neutralized through sufficient application of technology and vigilance. Its sensors monitored everything from solar flares to seismic activity, from nuclear weapons launches to the distinctive energy signatures of meta-human conflict. In the 17 years since its construction, the station had detected and helped prevent approximately 14,000 incidents that might have escalated into global catastrophes. It had never encountered anything remotely like Beerus. The first anomaly registered at 14:37 GMT, when 3 geosynchronous satellites experienced simultaneous catastrophic failures. The initial assessment flagged this as a possible weapons test or coordinated attack. Within 8 seconds, that assessment changed to unknown atmospheric phenomenon, when sensors detected energy readings that exceeded the measurement scales by several orders of magnitude. By 1438, every detection system on the Watchtower was screaming warnings in frequencies that ranged from bass rumbles to ultrasonic shrieks. The electromagnetic spectrum lit up like a Christmas tree strung by a drunk electrician. Gravitational sensors registered distortions that suggested either equipment malfunction or the presence of mass that shouldn't exist in local space. Temperature readings from the upper atmosphere spiked to values previously associated only with stellar coronas. Batman sat at the central command console, his cowled face illuminated by screens that struggled to display information faster than he could process it. His fingers moved across holographic interfaces with mechanical precision, isolating variables, cross-referencing databases, searching for patterns in what appeared to be pure chaos. The entity had entered Earth's orbital space from an approach vector that defied conventional physics. No acceleration phase, no deceleration burns, simply present at one moment and moving at orbital velocity the next, as if the concepts of momentum and inertia were suggestions rather than laws. The energy signature didn't match anything in the Watchtower's extensive database of known threats, which included Kryptonian technology, new god artifacts, Green Lantern constructs, and approximately 400 other categories of power sources that exceeded terrestrial norms. Batman expanded the analysis parameters, pulling data from ground-based installations and atmospheric monitors. The picture that emerged was simultaneously clearer and more disturbing. Whatever had entered orbit wasn't a vessel or a weapon, or even a conventional life form. The energy reading suggested a single entity, biological or something that approximated biology, radiating power at levels that should have required industrial infrastructure to sustain. He activated the priority communication channel. 300 miles below the Watchtower, in an apartment in Metropolis, where sunlight streaming through windows provided the only power source he would ever need. Clark Kent felt the communicator pulse against his wrist. The sensation was subtle, designed not to interrupt unless the situation warranted immediate attention. This particular pulse pattern indicated threat level cosmic, which meant either Darkseid had returned or something equally catastrophic had decided to visit. Clark's super hearing, already subconsciously monitoring Metropolis for signs of danger, focused on the Watchtower's transmission. Batman's voice, calm, but carrying undertones of urgency that Clark had learned to recognize over years of partnership, outlined the situation in approximately 45 seconds. Unknown entity. Orbital insertion. Energy signature exceeding baseline measurements. Descending toward Metropolis. Current altitude 20,000 feet and dropping. Estimated time to street level 3 minutes, assuming constant velocity. Clark stood moving with speed that turned the action into a blur, invisible to normal human perception. The civilian clothing dissolved into subspace storage, replaced by the suit that had become Earth's primary symbol of hope and protection. The window opened without conscious thought, and then he was airborne, accelerating upward through Metropolis airspace at velocities that would have generated sonic booms if he hadn't learned to manipulate the air around him to prevent such disruptions. The city blurred beneath him, buildings reduced to vertical streaks of color and glass. He cleared the troposphere in 4 seconds, entering the thinner air of the upper atmosphere, where normal aircraft couldn't function. His vision, capable of resolving details across the electromagnetic spectrum, searched the sky ahead for whatever had triggered the Watchtower's alarm. He found it at 19,000 feet, descending with the slow deliberation of an object that wasn't falling so much as choosing to move downward. Clark's first impression was of something small, roughly humanoid, suspended in mid-air without any visible means of propulsion. His second impression came from his energy perception, the sense that had been growing stronger over years of exposure to threats that operated beyond conventional physics. The entity radiated power like a sun radiated light, not metaphorically, but as a simple observable fact. Energy poured from its form in beams that made the air shimmer and distort. Clark's vision, attempting to analyze the phenomenon, reported readings that kept climbing past thresholds he had previously considered absolute maximums. He slowed his approach, stopping approximately 300 yards from the entity. At this distance, he could observe details. Purple skin or fur difficult to determine at this range. Humanoid body structure, though the proportions suggested feline rather than human templates. Clothing that appeared simple and functional rather than armored or ceremonial. And eyes that tracked his arrival with the casual interest of a predator watching potential prey. Clark's super hearing detected no heartbeat, which meant either the entity's cardiovascular system operated outside normal parameters, or it didn't possess one at all. His X-ray vision, attempting to penetrate the entity's form, encountered resistance for the first time in years. The energy aura functioned as shielding, rendering conventional observation methods useless. The entity's tail, which Clark hadn't initially noticed, swayed with the irregular rhythm of annoyance. The gesture was so quintessentially feline that despite the cosmic threat level, Clark found himself thinking of cats he had known in Smallville, their tails lashing before they knocked objects off tables. The entity watched him, didn't speak, didn't attack, simply observed with eyes that suggested intelligence operating on scales Clark couldn't immediately categorize. The air between them carried a pressure that had nothing to do with barometric readings and everything to do with the presence of power that exceeded comfortable assessment. Below them, at street level in Metropolis, the first tangible effects of Beerus's presence manifested in ways that emergency response protocols had never anticipated. the destructive energy leaking from his aura, invisible to normal perception, but real enough to interact with physical matter settled over the city like fog descending into a valley. It didn't behave according to conventional physics. Gravity didn't pull it downward. Wind didn't disperse it. It simply existed as a presence that reality itself found uncomfortable. Where the energy-concentrated effects occurred. An office building in the financial district experienced a cascade of blown transformers as electrical systems tried to accommodate power fluctuations that exceeded every safety parameter. The outage spread across 6 blocks in the space of 2 seconds, plunging thousands of computers into darkness and triggering backup generators that immediately overloaded. Traffic signals throughout the downtown core began cycling randomly, their solid-state electronics interpreting the energy interference as valid input. Within 30 seconds, intersections that had maintained smooth flow for years descended into gridlock. Horns blared, drivers shouted, and throughout the chaos, nobody looked up to see the source hovering in the sky above. The distortion in local gravity, subtle but measurable, caused buildings to creak as their structural loads redistributed. Steel beams flexed by microscopic amounts. Concrete settled into new configurations. The changes were small enough that the structures remained intact, but large enough that sensors designed to detect earthquake damage began transmitting warnings to city engineering departments. In Centennial Park, pigeons that had been roosting in trees suddenly took flight as their instincts registered a predator too large and too dangerous to confront. The flock scattered in all directions, creating a cloud of panicked birds that drew attention from pedestrians who still hadn't noticed the far more significant threat overhead. The Metropolis Police Department's Central Dispatch Center received 347 emergency calls in the span of 2 minutes, reporting everything from power outages to equipment malfunctions to vague feelings of unease that callers struggled to articulate. The operators, trained to remain calm during crises, found themselves fighting the same inexplicable anxiety that was driving the calls. Something felt wrong in a way that transcended normal categories of threat. And then Beerus's patients, already strained by interrupted sleep and dimensional displacement, and the general annoyance of existence, eroded past the point where unconscious control remained sufficient. He yawned. The gesture was entirely natural, no different from the thousands of yawns he had performed over millions of years. His jaw opened, his lungs expanded. Air entered and exited his respiratory system according to biological imperatives that had existed since his species evolved or was created, depending on which theological framework one preferred. The yawn also released approximately 0.003% of his destructive energy in an uncontrolled burst. The shockwave propagated outward at velocities approaching light speed, carrying energy that treated molecular bonds as polite suggestions. The air molecules in its path didn't compress or heat or react according to conventional thermodynamics. They simply ceased to exist, their constituent atoms scattered into component particles too small for conventional instruments to measure. The effect created a spherical void centered on Beerus's position, expanding to a radius of 120 feet, before the energy dissipated enough to stop actively unmaking matter. The void existed for approximately 40 milliseconds before atmospheric pressure collapsed it, creating a thunderclap that rattled windows across 6 square miles of Metropolis. The blast wave, purely acoustic now that the destructive energy had dispersed, propagated downward and outward. Windows on the upper floors of buildings within a 2-mile radius flexed, but held. Car alarms triggered across the entire downtown district. And in the streets below, thousands of people finally looked up to see what had created a sound like God clearing his throat. What they saw, those with sight lines not blocked by buildings, was a small purple figure hovering in the sky at an altitude where aircraft typically cruised. The figure appeared to be scratching behind one ear with a gesture so casual and mundane that it created cognitive dissonance with the energy readings that sensitive instruments were still struggling to quantify. Beerus, unaware that his yawn had just become the dominant topic of conversation across Metropolis, completed the scratch and returned his attention to the solar-powered being that had been maintaining a respectful distance. The being's energy signature had spiked during the shockwave, suggesting defensive reactions, or possibly the beginning of an attack. Beerus waited to see which it would be, his tail swaying with the patient rhythm of a cat watching a mouse decide whether to run. Superman, floating 300 yards away, reassessed every tactical assumption he had made in the previous 60 seconds. The shockwave had felt like standing in front of a shaped nuclear charge, all the force of atomic detonation compressed into a sphere barely larger than a house. His invulnerability had held, but the energy signature suggested this wasn't an attack. Wasn't even directed. Simply the ambient effect of the entity's presence, no more intentional than body heat. If an unconscious gesture could release that much power, what could the entity accomplish if it actually tried? The question remained academic because Beerus had already lost interest in Superman. The solar-powered being, registered as potentially strong by mortal standards, but nowhere near threatening enough to warrant serious attention. Instead, Beerus's focus shifted downward toward the city below and the more pressing question of where food might be located. He descended, not rapidly, but with the same casual disregard for gravity that had characterized his entire arrival. 5,000 feet became 4,000, 3,000, 2,000. The air grew thicker, warmer, carrying more sense of the city below. Cooking food, vehicle exhaust, the organic smell of millions of lives packed into close proximity. At 1,000 feet, the details of street level became clear. Buildings with their glass and steel facades. Roads clogged with vehicles that had stopped moving when the shockwave triggered their emergency systems. Crowds gathering on sidewalks, pointing upward with a universal human gesture of, "What the hell is that?" Beerus selected a landing zone with the care he might have given to choosing a place to nap. A street wide enough to accommodate his presence, far enough from tall buildings that he wouldn't need to dodge architecture, close enough to what appeared to be a restaurant district that food would be easily accessible. The chosen location was Fifth Avenue, a major thoroughfare that ran through the heart of Metropolis's commercial district. Under normal circumstances, the street carried approximately 4,000 vehicles per hour, and twice that many pedestrians. At 14:43 GMT, following 3 minutes of increasingly bizarre phenomena, the street held fewer than 100 people, most of whom were in the process of evacuating when Beerus descended through the final 1,000 feet. He touched down on the pavement with the lightness of a cat landing from a jump. No impact crater, no shockwave. Simply present where he hadn't been a moment before, standing in the middle of Fifth Avenue, as if he had been there all along and reality had just needed a moment to notice. The destructive energy still leaking from his aura created effects in his immediate vicinity that defied easy categorization. The asphalt beneath his feet didn't crack or melt, but the molecular structure reorganized itself into patterns that would have fascinated material scientists if they had possessed instruments capable of detecting such changes. The air around him shimmered with distortions that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with space itself being uncomfortable with his presence. Beerus stood in the middle of Fifth Avenue, tail swaying, expression neutral, and surveyed his surroundings with the critical eye of someone trying to decide if the available options were worth the effort of not destroying everything. The city around him had fallen into a silence that felt oppressive, despite the ambient noise of disabled vehicles and distant sirens. The crowds that hadn't evacuated stood frozen, watching, waiting for something they couldn't name, but knew with primal certainty was about to happen. Above, Superman descended to street level, landing 200 feet away, with his hands visible and non-threatening. His super senses were cataloging everything, sending information to his brain faster than conscious thought could process. The entity's power signature, the changes in local gravity, the way light bent around its form, all of it added up to a conclusion he didn't want to reach but couldn't avoid. This entity, whatever it was, operated on a scale that exceeded anything Earth's defenders had encountered before. Not stronger than Darkseid necessarily, but different in ways that made direct comparison impossible. And it had arrived in Metropolis, apparently looking for something, though, what remained unclear. Beerus's nose twitched. His enhanced senses designed to detect everything from approaching enemies to the subtle notes in complex wines analyzed the scents carried on the urban breeze. Restaurants, multiple establishments within walking distance. Some of them smelled promising, others less so. None of them smelled good enough to definitively spare the planet. But the day was young, and his standards, while exacting, weren't completely inflexible. His tail stopped swaying. His eyes, which had been scanning the street with mild interest, focused on a building 3 blocks north. The scent trail suggested Italian cuisine, possibly pasta, definitely involving tomatoes and garlic in combinations that triggered his culinary instincts. The decision formed without conscious deliberation. He would investigate the restaurant. If the food proved acceptable, he might delay destroying the planet until after dessert. If it disappointed, well, at least he would have a specific reason for the upcoming apocalypse, rather than the general malaise that currently motivated most of his destructive urges. Beerus took a step forward, a simple action that nonetheless sent ripples through local space-time. The asphalt where his foot had been showed a perfect impression, as if the pavement had been poured around his footprint and allowed to set. He took another step and another, walking toward the restaurant district with the purposeful stride of a god who had decided that dinner took priority over everything else, including the solar-powered being trailing behind him at a safe distance, and the hundreds of people watching from windows and doorways. The city held its breath, waiting to see if it would survive the next hour. Beerus, for his part, was already thinking about whether to start with soup or salad. Superman maintained his position 200 feet behind the entity, matching its walking pace with flight that required conscious effort to appear non-threatening. Every instinct developed over years of combat and crisis response screamed at him to act, to intervene, to do something other than trail behind a cosmic threat as it strolled through downtown Metropolis like a tourist searching for lunch. But his tactical assessment, refined through encounters with beings ranging from Doomsday to Darkseid, suggested that any aggressive action would prove counterproductive at best and catastrophic at worst. The entity hadn't attacked, hadn't made demands, hadn't demonstrated hostile intent beyond the collateral damage that seemed to accompany its mere existence. Acting first might transform a potentially manageable situation into something that exceeded Earth's capacity to survive. So he followed, watching, cataloging details that might prove relevant when this situation inevitably escalated beyond the current surreal calm. The entity moved with feline grace, each step placed with precision that suggested perfect body awareness. Its tail swayed in rhythm with its stride, the movement so natural that Superman found himself mentally comparing it to house cats he had observed over the years. The comparison should have been absurd, mapping behavior from domestic animals onto a being that radiated enough power to threaten planetary extinction. Yet the similarity persisted, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Civilians on the street scattered as the entity approached, their survival instincts overriding curiosity. Some ran into buildings. Others pressed themselves against walls, trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. A few stood paralyzed, their fight-or-flight responses apparently deciding that neither option offered meaningful protection. The entity ignored them all. Its attention remained fixed on something ahead, following a path that suggested destination rather than aimless wandering. Superman's enhanced vision tracked its sightline to a restaurant district 3 blocks north, an area known for its concentration of mid-range to upscale dining establishments. The entity appeared to be shopping for food. The absurdity of the situation would have been comical under different circumstances. An unknown cosmic entity capable of causing earthquakes with a yawn was apparently conducting a restaurant search in downtown Metropolis. Superman had faced alien invasions, interdimensional incursions, and at least 3 separate attempts to rewrite reality itself. None of those experiences had prepared him for this particular flavor of surreal. Above them, invisible to normal perception, but crystal clear to Superman's enhanced senses, the Watchtower continued its analysis. Satellite feeds tracked their progress through the city. Energy sensors measured fluctuations in the entity's power output, searching for patterns that might indicate intent or capability. And in the station's command center, Batman coordinated a response that balanced the need for preparedness against the risk of provocation. The communication channel in Superman's ear carried Batman's voice, calm and analytical, despite the circumstances. Energy signature remains constant. No indication of power buildup or preparation for attack. Behavior pattern suggests civilian mindset rather than military. Superman sub-vocalized his response, trusting the communicator's sensitivity to pick up words spoken barely above a whisper. Agreed. It's looking for something. Following scent markers, possibly. Enhanced olfactory capability evident from behavior. Wonder Woman is en route. ETA 4 minutes. Flash is in Central City responding to a trickster incident. Green Lantern is off-planet. Cyborg is monitoring from the Hall of Justice. Understood. Maintain distance protocol unless it demonstrates hostile action. Concur. The conversation ended, leaving Superman alone with his thoughts and the increasingly bizarre task of following a purple cat-like entity through Metropolis while it searched for dinner. Beerus's nose twitched again, analyzing scent molecules with precision that would have required millions of dollars worth of laboratory equipment to replicate. The Italian restaurant he had initially detected remained the strongest candidate, but other options presented themselves. A steakhouse 2 blocks west, a sushi establishment to the east, a French bistro that promised complexity in its aromatic signature. His tail lashed once, a gesture of mild frustration. Too many options, none of them obviously superior. In Universe 7, Whis would have researched the local cuisine ahead of time, identifying establishments worthy of divine attention and eliminating those that would only waste time. Here, without his attendant's guidance, Beerus faced the annoying necessity of making decisions without complete information. The Italian restaurant remained the safest choice. Pasta was difficult to ruin completely, and tomato-based sauces provided a reliable baseline for judging culinary competence. If the establishment proved disappointing, he could always destroy it and try another location. The planet housed billions of people. Statistically, at least a few of them must possess adequate cooking skills. His path took him past the electronics store, whose window display had been showing news coverage before the power fluctuations forced it offline. The dark screen reflected his image as he walked a purple figure barely 5 feet tall, striding through a city built for beings twice his height. The reflection showed his current expression, which a trained observer might have categorized as mildly annoyed with undertones of hunger. Behind him, Superman's reflection appeared larger, more imposing, radiating the classical heroic aesthetic that civilizations throughout history had associated with protectors and defenders. The contrast was stark enough to be almost comedic. The small figure leading the large figure following, both moving through empty streets in a procession that resembled parade more than confrontation. 4 blocks away, traveling at speeds that turned the cityscape into a blur of color and motion, Diana of Themyscira received the Watchtower's briefing while en route to Metropolis. The information was sparse, filtered through sensors that struggled to quantify what they were detecting. Unknown entity. Cosmic-level threat. Currently walking through downtown with Superman in pursuit. No hostile action yet, but energy readings suggested capability far exceeding standard meta-human parameters. Diana had faced gods before. Her own heritage connected her to the Olympians, and her centuries of life had included encounters with divine beings from multiple pantheons. She understood the patterns of divine behavior, the way immortals viewed mortal concerns, with mixture of interest and indifference that could shift without warning. This entity, whatever it represented, registered as divine by every metric she understood. The energy signature alone suggested fundamental power, rather than acquired ability. And the behavioral description, walking casually through a city it could presumably destroy without effort, fit the profile of a god operating under constraints of its own choosing, rather than external limitation. She adjusted her trajectory, aiming for an intercept point 2 blocks ahead of the entity's current position. Her arrival would transform this from a solo observation into something resembling an official response. The escalation was unavoidable, but her presence might provide additional deterrence if the entity's intentions proved hostile. Or it might provoke a fight that would level the city. Divine encounters carried that risk. Diana accepted it anyway. Protection required presence, and Metropolis was under her protection as much as any location on Earth. Beerus turned left onto 7th Avenue, following the scent trail toward the Italian restaurant. The street was wider than 5th Avenue, lined with buildings that combined retail space on the ground floor with offices or apartments above. Under normal circumstances, the sidewalks would have been crowded with lunch traffic and tourists. Now they stood empty, except for a few individuals who had been too slow or too stubborn to evacuate when the warnings began. He passed a coffee shop where 3 customers watched through the window with expressions that combined terror and fascination in roughly equal measure. Beerus noticed them with the same attention he might have given to interesting architecture, filed them under not immediately relevant, and continued walking. His tail swayed with increasing agitation. The restaurant was close now, less than a block away, but the anticipation was beginning to outweigh the satisfaction of approaching his goal. This was the problem with delayed gratification. The delay itself became annoying enough to diminish the eventual gratification. Behind him, Superman tracked the entity's mood through the subtle changes in its energy signature. The power output was increasing not dramatically, but enough to suggest emotional state fluctuation. Irritation, possibly, or impatience. The tail movements supported that interpretation, matching patterns he had observed in Earth felines. When frustrated, the entity was getting annoyed. Superman's threat assessment escalated accordingly. An annoyed cosmic entity was demonstrably more dangerous than a calm one. The shockwave from earlier had been unintentional, a side effect of a yawn. What might deliberate annoyance produce? He maintained his distance, prepared to intervene if the energy signature spiked toward what sensors identified as attack threshold. The preparation was likely futile. If the entity decided to act, Superman's response time would be measured in microseconds, while the attack itself might be functionally instantaneous. But futile preparation was better than no preparation at all. The restaurant came into view. Antonio's, according to the sign above the entrance, with a subtitle in smaller text claiming "Authentic Italian Cuisine since 1987. The establishment occupied the ground floor of a brick building that dated to the city's early expansion period, probably early 20th century based on architectural style. Windows facing the street showed white tablecloths and wine glasses catching afternoon light. A chalkboard outside listed daily specials in handwriting that suggested actual human composition rather than professional signage. Beerus stopped in front of the entrance, his nose twitching as he analyzed the scents emerging from the restaurant's ventilation system. Garlic, definitely. Tomatoes, basil, olive oil. The basic components of Italian cuisine prepared with what smelled like reasonable competence. Not exceptional, but possibly adequate. Adequate was a low bar, but his expectations had been calibrated downward by the general wrongness of this universe. If the food proved merely tolerable, that would represent a significant victory over the alternative of having his appetite completely ruined by incompetent cooking. He reached for the door handle, then paused. His hand, still a few inches from contact, had triggered a reaction in the metal. The brass handle, previously inert, now showed visible oxidation, spreading from the point closest to his palm. Tarnish accumulated in real-time, decades of corrosion, compressed into seconds as the destructive energy leaking from his aura interacted with base metal. Beerus observed this with the mild interest of someone noticing an unexpected side effect. The tarnishing process was aesthetically interesting, the way green-blue patina spread across the brass in fractal patterns. But it also represented a practical problem. If his passive aura was corroding door handles, the restaurant's interior might prove difficult to navigate without causing extensive property damage. He considered the situation for approximately 2 seconds, then shrugged with feline indifference. Property damage was the restaurant's problem, not his. If they couldn't maintain structural integrity in the presence of a god of destruction, they should have chosen a more durable construction material. His hand closed around the handle. The brass collapsed into powder, its molecular bonds overwhelmed by proximity to energy that operated on principles matter wasn't designed to withstand. The door, no longer secured by its handle, swung inward, on hinges that shrieked in protest as they experienced similar molecular decay. Beerus stepped through the entrance into Antonio's, his presence immediately triggering reactions throughout the restaurant's interior. Light bulbs flickered and died. The espresso machine behind the bar emitted a grinding sound as its circuitry experienced cascade failure. And in the kitchen, visible through a serving window, stainless steel surfaces began showing the same accelerated corrosion that had destroyed the door handle. The dining room was approximately half full, occupied by customers who had either not heard the evacuation warnings or had decided that lunch took priority over safety. Their conversations died as Beerus entered, replaced by silence so complete that the sound of his footsteps on tile seemed unnaturally loud. Beerus scanned the room with the same expression he had worn while walking through the city. Mild annoyance tinged with hunger. His gaze passed over customers, dismissed them as irrelevant, and focused on the kitchen where the actual important activity was occurring. A waiter, frozen in place with a plate of carbonara balanced on his palm, watched the purple entity cross the dining room toward an empty table. The waiter's brain, struggling to process what his eyes were reporting, generated approximately 15 questions simultaneously. None of them reached his mouth, which remained locked in an expression of shocked incomprehension. Beerus selected a table near the window, the location chosen for optimal light rather than strategic positioning. He sat, his small frame barely reaching a height where his eyes cleared the table's edge. The chair creaked under what should have been negligible weight, its wooden frame experiencing stress that had nothing to do with mass and everything to do with the local distortion of physics his presence created. He waited. Patiently by his standards, though, patient for a god of destruction, still meant a time frame measured in seconds rather than minutes. His tail curled around the chair leg, the gesture unconscious, while his eyes tracked movement in the kitchen. Outside, Superman landed on the sidewalk, with the silence of someone who had perfected the art of controlled descent. He remained outside the restaurant, observing through windows, while maintaining position that allowed rapid intervention if necessary. His X-ray vision penetrated the building's structure, tracking the entity's location and monitoring for signs of aggression. Wonder Woman arrived 30 seconds later, descending from the sky with considerably less concern for stealth. She landed beside Superman with an impact that cracked the concrete, her boots creating small craters that radiated outward in spiderweb patterns. She was tall, approaching 6 feet without the additional height her boots provided. Her armor gleamed in afternoon sunlight, a combination of ancient design and materials that exceeded modern metallurgy. The lasso of truth hung coiled at her waist, and her shield, though currently mag-locked to her back, was positioned for immediate deployment. Her eyes blue and ancient and carrying the weight of centuries found Superman's. He gestured toward the restaurant window. She looked. Through the glass, they watched a purple cat-like entity sit at a table in an Italian restaurant, tail swaying with what could only be described as impatience, apparently waiting for someone to take his order. Diana had fought in wars that spanned decades. She had stood against gods and monsters and entities that defied categorization. She had witnessed the fall of civilizations and the birth of new ages. In all that time, across all those experiences, she had never encountered a situation quite this bizarre. She glanced at Superman. He shrugged the gesture, conveying approximately 10 paragraphs worth of, "I have no idea what's happening either." Inside the restaurant, Beerus's patience reached its limit. He had waited approximately 45 seconds, which was 44 seconds longer than he typically tolerated between sitting down and being served. His tail stopped swaying. His eyes narrowed, and the ambient destructive energy leaking from his aura increased by a factor of 3, causing every piece of metal in the restaurant to begin corroding simultaneously. Outside, Superman's threat sensors screamed warnings. The situation, already precarious, was about to get considerably worse. The trigger, when it came, was absurdly mundane. A waiter, finally recovering enough cognitive function to remember his professional duties, approached Beerus's table carrying a menu and a water glass. The young man, perhaps 23 years old, with the kind of lean build that suggested either athletic dedication or fast metabolism, had worked at Antonio's for 2 years. In that time, he had served approximately 18,000 customers, handled everything from marriage proposals to business meetings, and maintained composure through incidents ranging from kitchen fires to customers who treated restaurant staff like servants rather than service providers. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for serving a purple cat-like entity that radiated power like a furnace radiated heat. His hand shook as he set the water glass on the table. The tremor was small, barely visible to normal observation, but enough to cause the glass to impact the wooden surface with slightly more force than optimal. The sound it produced was insignificant, a small clink that under normal circumstances would have been lost in the ambient noise of a functioning restaurant. The restaurant wasn't functioning normally. The power fluctuations had silenced the background music. The other customers sat frozen in horrified silence. And in that abnormal quiet, the clink of glass on wood registered as loud as a gunshot. Beerus's ear twitched. The waiter noticed the movement, interpreted it as annoyance, and did what his training and instincts both suggested. He attempted to apologize and smooth over the situation. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me just..." He reached for the water glass, intending to reposition it more carefully. His hand, still shaking from adrenaline and fear, knocked the glass sideways. Water spilled across the table, spreading in a puddle that soaked the tablecloth and dripped onto Beerus's lap. For approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. Beerus sat motionless, water darkening the fabric of his clothing, his expression unchanged. His tail, previously curled around the chair leg, went completely still. His eyes, which had been tracking the waiter's movements with mild interest, focused with the intensity of a predator identifying prey. The waiter opened his mouth to apologize again, but the words never emerged. Some survival instinct older than language, predating civilization itself, recognized danger at a fundamental level that transcended rational thought. His body froze, locked in place by autonomic responses that knew fleeing would be pointless and fighting would be suicide. Beerus stood. The motion was fluid, graceful, containing none of the irritation that Superman's sensors detected spiking in the entity's energy signature. He stepped away from the table water, still dripping from his clothes, and brushed at the wet fabric with one hand, in a gesture that would have been fastidious if not for the fact that his touch was causing the cloth to disintegrate. His patience, already worn to transparency by interrupted sleep and dimensional displacement and the accumulated minor annoyances of the past hour, finally eroded past the point where conscious control remained possible. The destructive energy that he normally maintained, at a low simmer, the baseline output that leaked from his form as inevitably as heat leaked from a star, surged upward. Not to combat levels, not even to what he would consider moderate exertion. Simply to a state that reflected his current emotional status, annoyed. The effect was catastrophic. Energy poured from Beerus in a wave that propagated outward at velocities approaching light speed. It didn't behave like conventional force. Didn't create pressure or heat or kinetic impact. Instead, it simply unmade whatever it touched, erasing matter at the molecular level, with the efficiency of an equation, solving for zero. The restaurant ceased to exist, not exploded, not demolished, but erased. The tables, chairs, dishes, decorations, structural elements, everything that comprised Antonio's physical existence converted directly into scattered particles too small to maintain cohesion. The building that had housed the restaurant for 37 years disappeared in the time it took for light to cross the dining room. The wave continued outward, expanding in a sphere centered on Beerus's position. It consumed the buildings on either side of the restaurant, swept through a bookstore that had occupied its location since 1952, erased a law office, a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, and 16 residential apartments. 100 feet from ground zero, the wave's intensity had decreased enough that it no longer achieved complete annihilation. Instead, it caused structural collapse, breaking molecular bonds that held steel beams together and turning concrete into powder. Buildings didn't fall so much as dissolve their mass, converting into dust that began settling even as the wave continued expanding. 200 feet out, the effect weakened further. Windows shattered, walls cracked. But structural integrity held, barely leaving buildings damaged, but standing. The wave passed through these structures like a ghost, causing damage without destroying, and continued its expansion into the city beyond. Superman, positioned 200 feet from the restaurant when the wave erupted, had approximately 30 milliseconds of warning before it reached him. His superhuman perception stretched those milliseconds into subjective seconds, time enough to assess the situation and realize that interposing himself between the wave and the city behind him was the only option that didn't result in unacceptable casualties. He flew forward, accelerating to velocities that turned the world into a blur, and positioned himself directly in the wave's path. His body, empowered by solar radiation and Kryptonian biology that operated on principles Earth science barely understood, served as a barrier between destruction and the millions of people in its path. The wave hit him like collision with a planet. Energy that erased matter at the molecular level encountered invulnerability that operated on similar fundamental scales. Superman's cellular structure, charged with solar power and reinforced by bioelectric fields that existed partly outside conventional space-time, resisted the unmaking effect through sheer, overwhelming durability. But resistance wasn't the same as immunity. Pain, a sensation Superman rarely experienced with any intensity, flooded his nervous system. His cells, struggling to maintain cohesion against energy designed to scatter them, consumed solar radiation at rates that would have depleted a normal Kryptonian in seconds. His bioelectric aura, the invisible field that protected his costume and allowed him to lift objects without them crumbling from the stress, flickered and failed. He held position for perhaps half a second, absorbing energy that could have leveled city blocks before the sheer magnitude of force overcame even Kryptonian durability. The wave didn't push him backward. It repelled him, treating his mass as an obstacle to be removed rather than an object to be moved. Superman found himself traveling backward at velocities that exceeded Mach 20, the air around him igniting from friction, despite his attempts to manipulate it, his trajectory carrying him away from Metropolis at an angle that would terminate somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. He cleared the city limits in 2 seconds, crossed the New Jersey coastline 3 seconds later, impacted the ocean surface 140 miles east of Delaware Bay with enough force to create a waterspout visible from the International Space Station. The ocean, indifferent to the drama occurring above its surface, accepted Superman into its depths with the same equanimity it showed to falling rain. He sank through water that turned to steam from the heat his passage generated, descending to depths where sunlight became a memory and pressure mounted to levels that would crush submarines like aluminum cans. He stopped sinking at approximately 2,000 feet, his momentum finally arrested by water resistance and his own deliberate deceleration. For a moment, he simply floated in the darkness, his body's healing mechanisms already repairing damage and replenishing solar reserves from the trace ultraviolet that penetrated this far below the surface. The entire sequence from impact to oceanic descent had taken 8 seconds. Back in Metropolis, Wonder Woman had reacted to the wave with warrior's instincts honed across centuries of combat. Where Superman had chosen to absorb the impact, Diana chose to deflect it. Her bracers, forged from 8th metal and inscribed with protections that predated human civilization, came up in a defensive cross. The bracelets could deflect bullets, energy beams, and according to legend, the wrath of gods themselves. She had used them to turn aside everything from conventional firearms to Darkseid's Omega beams. The destructive wave hit her bracers with force that transcended conventional physics. The 8th metal held its molecular structure too fundamentally stable to be unmade by anything short of universal extinction events. But the force behind the wave, the sheer magnitude of energy-seeking outlet, found pathways around the obstruction. Diana felt the impact like standing in front of a shaped nuclear charge. Her bracers absorbed and deflected the direct assault, but the energy that spilled around their protective field struck her body with enough force to overcome even Amazon durability. She flew backward, her trajectory lower and faster than Superman's, impacting the street hard enough to create a crater 15 feet deep and 40 feet across. The asphalt and concrete and underlying bedrock compressed under the impact, creating a shockwave that shattered windows for 2 blocks and triggered car alarms across half the city. Diana's impact continued through the street surface into the subway tunnel beneath. Her body, still traveling at velocities measured in hundreds of miles per hour, tore through the tunnel's ceiling like it was paper, crossed the empty space where trains normally ran, and embedded itself in the far wall with enough force to crack the concrete for 30 feet in all directions. She stopped moving, her body held in place by the crater her impact had created, and took inventory of damage. Ribs cracked, left shoulder dislocated, minor lacerations across her arms and face where the energy had found gaps in her defenses. Nothing life-threatening for an Amazon, but painful enough to require conscious effort to maintain focus. The healing was already beginning, her divine heritage accelerating recovery to rates that would seem miraculous by mortal standards. But the injury itself, the fact that she had been wounded by what appeared to be a casual gesture, provided tactical information worth the pain. This entity operated on a scale that exceeded anything the Justice League had encountered in conventional combat. Back at Ground Zero, where Antonio's had existed less than 10 seconds ago, Beerus stood in the center of a circular zone of absolute destruction, approximately 400 feet in diameter. The buildings immediately surrounding this zone showed varying degrees of damage from complete collapse to superficial cracking, creating a gradient of destruction that radiated outward until reaching areas where the only evidence of catastrophe was shattered glass and activated alarms. Beerus surveyed the destruction with the same expression he had worn in the restaurant, mild annoyance with undertones of hunger. The spilled water had been irritating. The destruction it prompted had been reflexive. And now he stood in the ruins of what had promised to be an adequate meal. Still hungry, still annoyed, and no closer to finding food than he had been an hour ago. His tail swayed with increasing agitation, above transmitted through satellite feeds to the Watchtower and every major defense installation on Earth. The aftermath of Beerus's annoyance became visible. A circular crater in downtown Metropolis, approximately 400 feet across and varying in depth from complete erasure at the center to shallow surface damage at the edges. Secondary destruction radiating outward for several blocks. And, in various locations around the city, the scattered defenders who had attempted to contain the threat. Batman's voice transmitted through communication channels that reached every Justice League member simultaneously carried the calm of someone who had learned to function while terror clawed at his mind. Threat assessment upgraded to extinction level. Entity demonstrates casual destruction capability exceeding nuclear weapons. Conventional engagement is not viable. Recommend immediate evacuation of Metropolis and surrounding areas. Radius 50 miles, minimum. In Central City, Flash heard the transmission while subduing Trickster with one hand. His perception, operating at speeds where seconds stretched into subjective hours, processed the information while his body continued moving through the arrest procedures on autopilot. Extinction level meant exactly what it sounded like. A threat capable of ending human civilization, if not stopped. The Justice League had protocols for such situations developed during the dark hours, when contingency planning felt like paranoia rather than prudence. Protocol 7. Assume conventional combat will fail. Prioritize evacuation over engagement. Contain if possible, delay if not, and prepare for scenarios where Earth survival required decisions nobody wanted to make. Flash finished securing Trickster, transmitted a brief explanation to Central City Police, and disappeared in a streak of lightning that carried him toward Metropolis at velocities approaching light speed. In the ocean, 140 miles from Delaware Bay, Superman emerged from the water like a missile launching from a submarine. His body fully healed from the impact and recharged by the solar radiation he had absorbed during his brief time in sunlight. Accelerated upward through the atmosphere at speeds that turned air into plasma around him. He cleared the ocean surface, achieved orbital altitude in 4 seconds, and oriented himself toward Metropolis. His enhanced vision, capable of resolving details across hundreds of miles, showed him the destruction pattern in the city center. Showed him Wonder Woman extracting herself from the subway tunnel. Showed him the purple entity standing in the center of the devastation, apparently unbothered by the chaos it had created. Superman's jaw tightened. His hands clenched into fists. And despite every tactical assessment suggesting that direct confrontation would prove futile at best and catastrophic at worst, he angled his trajectory toward Metropolis and prepared to do what he had always done when Earth faced impossible threats. He would try anyway. In the ruins of Antonio's, Beerus's stomach growled. The sound was soft, barely audible over the settling debris and distant sirens. But to his enhanced hearing, it might as well have been a thunderclap. He was still hungry. The restaurant was gone. And now he faced the annoying necessity of finding alternative dining options in a city that appeared to be evacuating around him. His tail lashed once, releasing another pulse of destructive energy that vaporized a cubic mile of atmosphere and created a thunderclap that rattled windows across 3 boroughs. Beerus sighed the exhalation, carrying enough force to scatter debris in a 20-foot radius. This universe, he decided, was proving significantly more irritating than first impressions had suggested. Perhaps destroying the planet and searching for food elsewhere would be more efficient than continuing to deal with spilled water and inadequate service. Apocalypse hung in space like a cancerous growth on reality itself. A planet that had long ago abandoned any pretense of natural formation in favor of pure function. Its surface was entirely artificial continents of industrial architecture, stretching from pole to pole, mountains of machinery that served purposes ranging from weapons manufacture to the systematic oppression of populations numbered in the billions. Fire pits burned across the landscape, their flames fed by substances that would have been toxic to conventional biology. The sky. What passed for sky on a world where atmosphere was maintained through technological force rather than planetary formation, glowed a perpetual red-orange, creating twilight that never resolved into day or night. In the center of the largest structure, a fortress that dwarfed cities and contained enough firepower to sterilize galaxies, Darkseid sat upon a throne, constructed from stone, that predated the current universe. The throne room stretched for half a mile, in every direction, its ceiling lost in shadows that existed independently of conventional lighting. Pillars the size of skyscrapers supported architecture that followed rules of geometry that made human mathematicians uncomfortable. Darkseid himself was massive, approaching 9 feet in height, without the additional elevation his throne provided. His body was stone-made animate, or something that resembled stone enough that the distinction became academic. Gray skin that looked like it had been carved from granite. Eyes that glowed red with power that operated on principles beyond conventional energy. And an expression that suggested the universe existed primarily to disappoint him with its inadequacy. He had ruled apocalypse for millennia that stretched toward geological timescales, had conquered civilizations numbered in the thousands, had fought wars that restructured entire sectors of space. And through it all, he had pursued a singular goal with patience that made glaciers seem hasty: the acquisition of the anti-life equation, the mathematical proof that would allow him to dominate all sentient will in the universe. The pursuit had been interrupted approximately 17 minutes ago by a disturbance in local space that his sensors initially classified as impossible and subsequently reclassified as unprecedented. Energy had entered the universe from outside, not from another dimension, which happened occasionally and could be managed. Not from parallel realities in the local multiverse, which was inconvenient but understood. From outside the entire DC multiverse structure, penetrating barriers that were meant to be absolute. Darkseid had noticed immediately. His attention, normally distributed across hundreds of simultaneous projects and campaigns, focused on the anomaly with the intensity he usually reserved for matters relating directly to the anti-life equation. The sensors built into Apocalypse's infrastructure provided data in formats that would have required translation for lesser beings to comprehend. Darkseid absorbed the information directly, his mind processing inputs that spanned the electromagnetic spectrum and several dozen frequencies that existed partly outside conventional physics. The entity that had entered his universe radiated energy that followed rules. Apocalypse databases didn't recognize. Not magic, though it shared characteristics with mystical forces. Not conventional physics, though it interacted with matter in ways that suggested some underlying principles. Something else entirely operating according to frameworks that this reality had never been designed to accommodate. The entity's trajectory had carried it directly to Earth, that irritating backwater planet, that had proven surprisingly resistant to his previous attempts at conquest. Darkseid's interest increased. Anything that showed interest in Earth warranted investigation, if only to determine whether it represented opportunity or obstacle. His throne room contained technologies that would have seemed indistinguishable from magic to civilizations who still believed their gods were supernatural rather than sufficiently advanced. Sensors that could track individual atoms across light years. Communication devices that transmitted faster than light by treating space-time as a suggestion. And observation systems that could pierce through most forms of concealment to observe events in real time across vast distances. Darkseid activated these systems with a thought the gesture too subtle for physical manifestation. Screens materialized in the air around his throne, each displaying different aspects of the situation unfolding on Earth. Energy readings, visual observation, gravitational distortion maps, temporal analysis showing how the entity's presence was affecting local space-time. He watched the entity descend to Earth's surface, observed its interaction with the planet's defenders, noted the complete disparity in power levels between the entity and anything Earth could field against it. And when the entity released a pulse of destructive energy that carved a crater into downtown Metropolis and scattered Earth's champions like children's toys, Darkseid's expression shifted by microns into something that might, in lesser beings, have indicated satisfaction. Here was power worth noting. Not on his level, perhaps, but operating in ranges that suggested this entity was divine rather than merely enhanced. A god or something functionally equivalent operating outside the pantheons and hierarchies that Darkseid had catalogued over his long existence. The observation raised questions. Where had this entity originated? What were its capabilities at full power rather than the casual demonstration he had just witnessed? And most importantly, could it be controlled, killed, or converted into a resource that advanced Darkseid's goals? He required more data. Observation provided information, but interaction revealed truth. And the most efficient form of interaction when dealing with entities of unknown capability was combat. Darkseid stood from his throne, the gesture carrying finality that made reality itself pay attention. His form, already massive, seemed to expand in dimensions that transcended simple physical height. The throne room darkened, as if light itself was reluctant to remain in his presence, when his full attention focused on external matters. He raised one hand, extending his arm toward the screens, showing Earth's location. His eyes, normally glowing a dull red, brightened to an intensity that would have been painful to observe directly. Energy gathered at his pupils, condensing into points of crimson light that contained power measured in megatons. The Omega beams, Darkseid's most reliable weapon, capable of pursuing targets across continents through dimensions around obstacles that should have provided protection. The beams could disintegrate matter, teleport objects, or simply kill with the absolute certainty that gave them their name. He had used them to execute gods, destroy armies, and demonstrate to recalcitrant civilizations that resistance to his will was futile. He had never used them across interuniversal distances to test an entity whose origin and nature remained unknown. There was Darkseid reflected in the microsecond before firing a first time for everything. The beams erupted from his eyes, twin streams of crimson energy that tore through the throne room's atmosphere with thunderclaps that shattered stone pillars for 100 yards in all directions. The energy traveled at velocities that made light speed seem pedestrian, covering the distance to the throne room's designated firing port in less time than it took for sound to propagate afoot. But crossing a throne room was trivial. The beam's real journey began when they exited Apocalypse's atmosphere and entered the void beyond. Conventional space couldn't accommodate the Omega effect. The beams didn't travel through normal geometry so much as impose their own path onto reality, forcing the universe to connect point A to point B, regardless of the distance or obstacles between them. They carved through the fabric of space-time like hot wire through wax, leaving temporary channels that reality struggled to heal behind them. The distance between Apocalypse and Earth measured in light years that numbered in the hundreds. For conventional travel even at faster-than-light velocities, the journey would have required hours or days. The Omega beams crossed the gap in approximately 3 seconds, treating stellar distances as minor inconveniences rather than absolute barriers. They emerged in Earth's orbital space with the same violence that had characterized their departure, tearing into local reality with force that triggered every sensor on the Watchtower simultaneously. Batman, already dealing with the crisis in Metropolis, found himself confronted with a new threat before the old one had been resolved. The beams angled downward, tracking toward Metropolis with the precision of guided missiles and the inevitability of mathematical proofs. They wove through the upper atmosphere, leaving ionization trails that would take hours to dissipate, and descended toward the coordinates where sensors indicated the unknown entity still stood. Beerus, standing in the ruins of what had been Antonio's, noticed the approaching energy approximately 0.3 seconds before it reached him. His tail, previously swaying with irritation, went still. His ears rotated toward the incoming threat with mechanical precision, and his eyes, which had been scanning the surrounding destruction with bored annoyance, focused upward to track the crimson beams descending from the sky. His first impression was that someone somewhere had decided his presence warranted attack. His second impression was that whoever had made this decision possessed neither the good sense to approach cautiously, nor the power to make aggression anything other than suicide. The Omega beams struck him dead center, their energy designed to erase targets from existence by rewriting their fundamental nature. They hit with force measured in gigatons, compressed into streams, barely 6 inches wide, carrying enough destructive power to vaporize mountains. Beerus raised one hand palm outward in a gesture so casual it looked like he was waving away an annoying insect. His destructive energy, operating at levels barely above his resting baseline, met the Omega effect in the space 6 inches from his palm. The collision occurred at scales where quantum mechanics became relevant. Two different forms of fundamental power, trying to occupy the same space while following incompatible rules about what matter should or shouldn't be. For a microsecond, the universe couldn't decide which effect should take precedence. Then Beerus's energy, backed by the authority of a god of destruction and operating under rules that predated this universe's formation, simply erased the Omega beams from existence. The crimson streams, which had carved through dimensions to reach their target, scattered into harmless light and dissipated like smoke in wind, their component energy, stripped of coherence and purpose, radiated away as waste heat that raised the local temperature by 3 degrees Fahrenheit across a cubic mile of atmosphere. Beerus lowered his hand. His expression hadn't changed. The gesture had required exactly as much effort as waving away an insect, which is to say, effectively none. His tail resumed its irritated swaying, and his attention returned to the more pressing question of where he might find food, now that the restaurant had been accidentally destroyed. On Apocalypse, Darkseid watched his Omega beams scatter into nothing, through sensors that provided detail down to the quantum level. His eyes dimmed back to their normal intensity. His posture, already rigid with the discipline of millennia, somehow became even more controlled. The beams had been a test, not a serious attack. He had expected them to be blocked or deflected. Entities powerful enough to register as divine typically possess defenses against conventional assassination methods. But to see them simply unmade, scattered as if they were nothing more than laser pointers rather than weapons that had killed gods, provided information worth the expenditure of energy. This entity operated on principles that superseded even the Omega effect. Not through superior power necessarily, though power was certainly involved, but through fundamental compatibility, as if the entity's nature simply took precedence over whatever rules governed this universe's operations. It was Darkseid reflected similar to how his own true form could overwhelm the multiverse through sheer ontological weight, but where his true form was too large for this reality to accommodate. Without catastrophic damage, this entity appeared to exist here without such constraints. Interesting. And more importantly, useful if properly controlled. Darkseid's throne room contained a boom tube generator, one of many scattered across Apocalypse's surface. The technology allowed for instantaneous travel across astronomical distances and between dimensions, creating portals that connected any 2 points in space, regardless of the obstacles between them. He activated the generator with a thought-selecting coordinates that would place him in Metropolis, approximately 200 yards from the entity's current position, close enough to observe and interact, far enough to react if the situation required strategic withdrawal rather than direct confrontation. The boom tube opened with its characteristic thunder, a sound like reality breaking along invisible seams. The portal appeared in the throne room center, a vertical oval of crackling energy that showed a view of Metropolis's ruins through its aperture. Darkseid stepped through without hesitation, his massive form transitioning from Apocalypse to Earth in the span of a single stride. Behind him, the throne room fell silent. The screens displaying Earth's status remained active, but without their master's attention, they were simply machinery fulfilling programmed functions. On Earth, in the ruins of downtown Metropolis, a second cosmic entity arrived to confront the first. The afternoon, which had already proven more eventful than most years, was about to get significantly more complicated. Beerus's tail stopped swaying. His nose twitched, detecting the ozone smell and dimensional distortion that accompanied the boom tube's opening. His eyes, previously focused on the surrounding destruction, shifted to track the new arrival with interest that approached actual engagement. Finally, he thought with satisfaction that would have been dangerous in anyone with less power to back it up. Someone who might actually be worth fighting. Or, at the very least, someone who would provide entertainment before he destroyed this planet and moved on to finding dinners somewhere less annoying. The boom tube discharged Darkseid into Metropolis with a thunderclap that shattered windows across a 3-mile radius. The portal's energies, barely contained by technology, that bent space-time into configurations nature had never intended, spilled into Earth's atmosphere as exotic radiation that made sensors scream and birds fall from the sky in confused spirals. Darkseid emerged, walking each step measured and deliberate, crossing from the flame-lit darkness of Apocalypse into the afternoon sun of Earth without breaking stride. The transition would have been jarring for lesser beings, moving between worlds separated by hundreds of light-years in the span of a footstep. For Darkseid, it was simply another demonstration of how thoroughly he had mastered the fundamental forces that constrained normal existence. He stood 9 feet tall in his current manifestation, though this avatar body represented only a fraction of his true form's mass and power. His true form existed in a realm beyond the multiverse, too vast and too dense to enter conventional reality without causing the entire structure to collapse under ontological weight. This avatar, carved from his essence and projected into the local universe, possessed perhaps 1% of his full capability. 1% was still sufficient to reduce planets to ash. His eyes swept across the ruins of downtown Metropolis, cataloging destruction with the dispassion of an engineer assessing structural damage. The crater where the restaurant had been. The collapsed buildings radiating outward from ground zero. The scattered evidence of the entity's power displayed through casual annoyance rather than deliberate attack. Impressive in the way a natural disaster was impressive. The entity had demonstrated capability exceeding most threats Darkseid had encountered in his conquest of thousands of civilizations. But capability without control was simply chaos. And chaos could be directed, manipulated, or eliminated according to strategic necessity. Beerus stood 200 yards distant, positioned in the exact center of the destruction he had created. His small form, barely reaching 5 feet in height, should have appeared insignificant against Darkseid's massive presence. Should have registered as beneath notice, a minor entity accidentally stumbling into matters far beyond its comprehension. The energy signature radiating from that small form suggested otherwise. Darkseid's analytical systems, honed through millennia of combat against everything from gods to fundamental forces, made manifest categorize the entity's power with increasing precision. Divine, certainly divine, but operating under frameworks his databases didn't recognize. The energy patterns resembled destruction-based deities he had encountered, but cleaner, more focused, as if destruction wasn't a tool or weapon, but a fundamental aspect of the entity's nature. The two stood in silence, separated by 200 yards of devastated urban landscape. Neither moved, neither spoke. But the air between them carried pressure that had nothing to do with barometric readings and everything to do with the presence of power that warped local reality through sheer existence. The Justice League, observing from various positions around the battlefield, felt that pressure like weight settling on their chests. Superman, having returned from the Atlantic at velocities that turned the sound barrier into a suggestion, hovered 3 miles above the confrontation with his enhanced vision tracking every micron of movement. Wonder Woman, extracted from the subway tunnel and mostly healed from her injuries, stood on a rooftop 5 blocks away with her hand on her sword. And in the Watchtower, Batman coordinated evacuation efforts while simultaneously running tactical simulations that all concluded with variations of "everyone dies." Flash arrived in a streak of lightning that terminated on a building ledge half a mile from ground zero. His perception, operating at speeds where seconds stretched into subjective minutes, allowed him to observe the scene in detail that normal human consciousness couldn't process. He saw the way space-time bent around both entities, saw the quantum fluctuations that accompanied their presence, and saw with the clarity that came from existing partially outside normal temporal flow that whatever was about to happen would exceed anything the League had previously encountered. Beerus moved first. The motion was small, barely qualifying as movement. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, adjusting his stance by perhaps 2 inches. The gesture was unconscious, automatic, and the kind of preparatory movement a martial artist makes before engaging an opponent. The shockwave it generated traveled outward at supersonic velocities, carrying enough force to crack pavement and shatter the remaining intact windows for half a mile in all directions. Darkseid didn't react to the shockwave, didn't brace or defend, simply stood unmoved as the pressure wave broke against his form and dissipated. His eyes glowing dull red with Omega energy held in check, focused on Beerus with the intensity reserved for targets worth his personal attention. He raised one hand palm forward in a gesture that looked almost like greeting. Energy gathered at his fingertips, crimson light condensing into visible manifestation. Not the Omega beams this time. Those had proven ineffective. Instead, pure Omega energy, unrefined and overwhelming, compressed into a sphere that contained more destructive force than most nuclear arsenals. He thrust his palm forward, releasing the energy in a wave that crossed the distance between them faster than light could propagate through the intervening space. Beerus tilted his head, the motion feline in its casual precision, and stepped sideways. The Omega wave passed through the space he had occupied milliseconds before, its passage turning air into plasma and asphalt into glass. The wave continued past him, traveled another 300 yards, and impacted a building that had somehow survived the earlier destruction. The structure didn't explode, didn't collapse. Simply ceased to exist, its molecular bonds overwhelmed by energy that operated at scales where matter was negotiable. Beerus completed his sidestep, returned to a neutral stance, and yawned. The gesture was genuine, not affected. He had been awake for nearly an hour now, his interrupted sleep still weighing on him like physical exhaustion. The yawn released the tension in his jaw, provided momentary satisfaction, and incidentally generated another shockwave that vaporized approximately 40 cubic yards of atmosphere. It also apparently represented sufficient provocation for Darkseid to escalate from testing to actual combat. The new god moved with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something his size. One moment standing still, the next crossing 200 yards of space in less time than it took for sound to travel 10 feet. His fist, carved from stone that had seen the birth and death of galaxies, drove toward Beerus's position with enough force behind it to shatter mountains. Beerus raised one hand, caught the punch in his palm, and stopped Darkseid's momentum with the same effort someone might use to catch a thrown ball. The impact generated a pressure wave that traveled outward in a perfect sphere, compressing air into a shell of superheated plasma that expanded at supersonic velocities. The ground beneath them, already weakened by previous destruction, cracked and shattered. A crater formed not from the force of impact, but from the sheer pressure of two cosmic entities making physical contact. For a moment they stood frozen in tableau. Darkseid's fist caught in Beerus's palm. Beerus looking up at Darkseid with expression that suggested mild interest rather than concern. And between them, reality struggling to accommodate forces it hadn't been designed to contain. Beerus pushed. The motion was gentle by his standards, barely qualifying as effort. But gentle at cosmic scales translated to catastrophic at human ones. Darkseid found himself traveling backward, his massive form launched through the air like a missile, crossing the crater and continuing for another quarter mile before his trajectory terminated in a building that collapsed on impact. Debris fell like snow, coating the street in pulverized concrete and twisted steel. The dust cloud that rose from the collapse obscured visibility for blocks in all directions. And through that obscuring cloud, Darkseid emerged, his stone-like skin cracked but intact, his eyes blazing with light that turned the dust cloud red. His omega beams lanced out twin streams of crimson energy that curved through the air with intelligence beyond targeting systems. The beams didn't travel in straight lines, didn't follow ballistic trajectories. They pursued, adapted, seeking their target with the determination of predators tracking prey. Beerus watched them approach with the same expression he had worn while examining the restaurant district. Mild interest tinged with growing annoyance. The beams curved toward him, splitting and recombining in patterns designed to overwhelm defensive capabilities through sheer unpredictability. He raised both hands, palms outward, and released a pulse of destructive energy that expanded in a sphere centered on his position. The omega beam struck the expanding sphere and scattered like light through a prism. Their coherence broke in their targeting. Intelligence disrupted, they dissipated into harmless radiation that raised the background temperature by a few degrees. Darkseid emerged from the dust cloud at a dead run, his massive legs covering ground with strides that ate distance like a sprinter on cosmic steroids. His speed, enhanced by apocalyptic technology and divine nature, carried him across the battlefield at velocities approaching Mach 3. Beerus waited until Darkseid was within arm's reach, then moved. His speed, when he chose to actually employ it, exceeded Darkseid's by orders of magnitude. One moment standing still, the next positioned behind Darkseid with one hand extended. His palm made contact with Darkseid's back, and destructive energy flooded into the new god's body through the point of contact. Darkseid's stone skin, tough enough to withstand stellar heat and pressure measured in gigatons, cracked. Fissures spread from the impact point, racing across his back and shoulders like lightning across a dark sky. The cracks glowed purple with energy that shouldn't exist in this universe, destructive force trying to unmake matter at the molecular level. Darkseid roared the sound, carrying harmonics that made buildings vibrate, and survivors 3 miles away clutched their ears in pain. He spun his backhand strike, missing Beerus by inches as the smaller entity dodged with feline grace. The miss didn't matter. The shockwave from the strike carved a furrow in the ground 20 feet wide and 300 feet long, displacing enough debris to bury a city block. They separated, establishing distance that lasted approximately half a second before Darkseid closed it again. His fists, backed by strength that had shattered planets, rained down in combinations too fast for normal perception to track. Each strike carried megatons of force. Each miss generated shockwaves that propagated for miles. Beerus dodged every attack with movements so economical they seemed lazy. Slight shifts of position, minimal adjustments that nonetheless placed him exactly where Darkseid's fists weren't. His tail swayed with each dodge, the motion almost playful, as if this were a game rather than combat between cosmic entities. Above them, Superman watched with growing horror as the battle's collateral damage mounted. Each shockwave weakened structures across the city. Each energy release pushed Earth's crust toward the breaking point. The planet wasn't designed to accommodate this level of conflict. Conventional superhuman combat stressed local geology. This was stressing the planetary structure itself. He activated his communicator, his voice carrying urgency that transcended professional calm. "Batman, we need evacuation expanded to the entire eastern seaboard, possibly the whole continent. Seismic sensors are showing stress fractures forming in the mantle." Batman's response was immediate, filtered through communication systems that remained operational despite the electromagnetic chaos saturating local space. "Already in progress. Every teleporter we can access is pulling people out. It's not enough. Population density is too high and time frame is too short." Wonder Woman's voice joined the channel, strained but controlled. "The mystical community is responding. Fate and Zatanna are preparing intervention. ETA unknown. Tell them to hurry," Superman replied, watching Beerus deliver a strike that sent Darkseid crashing through 3 buildings before his trajectory terminated a quarter-mile away. "I don't think we have much time." On the ground, the battle reached new intensity. Darkseid, his avatar body showing damage but still functional, began channeling Omega energy at maximum sustainable levels. His entire form glowed crimson eyes blazing like miniature stars. The energy radiating from him was sufficient to melt rock and vaporize anything combustible within a 100-foot radius. He raised both hands, gathering power that made the air itself scream in protest, and unleashed an Omega blast that contained enough concentrated destruction to sterilize a continent. The energy wave read black and shot through with lightning that existed partly outside normal space-time, expanded toward Beerus with the inevitability of a tsunami. Beerus's response was to extend one finger. A single sphere of purple-black energy, no larger than a marble, formed at his fingertip. The sphere compressed, became denser, rotated with motion that suggested it existed in more dimensions than the 3 visible ones. When it achieved sufficient density, Beerus flicked it forward with the same casual motion he had used to destroy planets earlier. The sphere and the Omega blast met at the midpoint between the combatants. Reality screamed. The collision occurred at scales where quantum mechanics became relevant and classical physics gave up entirely. 2 fundamentally incompatible forms of destructive energy tried to occupy the same space while operating under completely different rules about what should happen when matter encountered annihilation. The result was an explosion that exceeded nuclear weapons in scope, if not mechanism. A sphere of pure destruction expanded from the collision point, traveling outward at speeds approaching light. Everything within that sphere, air, debris, pavement, building fragments, even photons trying to escape, simply ceased to exist. The sphere reached a radius of 300 feet before the competing energies neutralized each other and the expansion stopped. In its wake, it left a perfect hemispherical void, a bubble of absolute nothing carved into downtown Metropolis. Reality rushed to fill the vacuum, generating a thunderclap that shattered windows in Philadelphia and triggered seismographs as far away as Chicago. The pressure equalization created winds approaching tornado force that scattered debris across the city and knocked over anything not anchored to bedrock. Beerus and Darkseid emerged from the aftermath on opposite sides of the void. Both were standing. Both showed damage, Darkseid's stone skin fractured in multiple locations, Beerus's clothing torn and singed. Neither appeared defeated. Beerus examined his damaged clothing with the kind of irritation someone might show after discovering a wine stain on a favorite shirt. His tail lashed once, then twice, the motion conveying frustration that had less to do with the battle and more to do with the general accumulation of annoyances since arriving in this universe. Interrupted sleep, destroyed restaurant, spilled water, damaged clothing, and now extended combat with an opponent who, while not actually threatening, was proving resilient enough to be tedious rather than entertaining. His patience, already worn to transparency, finally eroded past the point where continuation seemed worthwhile. He had come to this universe by accident, had descended to this planet looking for food, had been met with inadequate service, annoying interruptions, and now combat that was stretching past the point where it provided entertainment value. Enough. Beerus's energy signature, which had been fluctuating in response to the battle's demands, suddenly stabilized at a level that made every sensor on the planet spike into red zone simultaneously. His eyes, previously showing mild interest, narrowed into expression that suggested actual annoyance. His tail stopped lashing and went rigid, straight as an arrow. Superman, observing from above, felt his threat assessment escalate past every previous threshold. Whatever the entity had been doing before, it had been playing. This was the beginning of something else. Darkseid felt it too. His tactical analysis, operating at speeds that processed information faster than quantum computers, recognized the shift for what it was. The test phase was over. The entity was preparing to end this. He began gathering Omega energy for one final overwhelming strike, channeling power that would leave his avatar body depleted but might possibly actually harm his opponent enough to matter. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, space itself began to distort. Not from the battle, not from the energies being thrown around by cosmic entities treating physics as optional. This was different, deliberate, calculated. The work of intelligences that understood exactly what they were doing. Dr. Fate arrived first, descending from the sky with Nabu's presence radiating from the golden helmet. Behind him, Zatanna materialized through a portal that smelled of backwards words and stage magic made real. Phantom Stranger simply appeared as if he had always been standing on that particular street corner and everyone had temporarily forgotten to notice. And from the Earth itself, Swamp Thing emerged, bringing with it the weight of planetary consciousness and the Green's collective attention. They formed a perimeter around the battlefield, positioned at cardinal points, and began to work. Reality, already stressed beyond normal tolerance by the conflict between Beerus and Darkseid, found itself being gently but firmly reshaped by practitioners who understood its underlying structure. Space folded, dimensions twisted, and the battlefield, along with its two cosmic combatants, began separating from Earth's conventional geography. Beerus felt the shift, recognized it as external interference. and made a decision that would have far-reaching implications for everyone involved. He was bored. The fight had lost what little entertainment value it possessed. The planet had proven disappointing in every meaningful way. And now mystical practitioners were attempting to manipulate space around him as if he were a problem to be managed rather than a god to be respected. Fine. If they wanted him gone, he would leave. But on his terms, not theirs. His energy signature began to climb toward levels that would make everything previous seem like warm-up exercises. And in the Watchtower, Batman's threat assessment upgraded one final time to a category that had never been used before. Planetary extinction imminent. Dr. Fate existed in multiple states simultaneously. His physical form, constructed from Kent Nelson's mortal flesh and Nabu's divine presence, occupied normal space-time. But his consciousness extended through dimensions that most beings couldn't perceive, touching the fundamental structures that held reality together. He experienced existence as a web of connections, each strand representing a different aspect of cosmic order. One of those strands was breaking. He had felt the disturbance hours ago when Beerus first entered this universe. The initial tear had been small, a minor disruption in the fabric separating dimensions. Concerning, but manageable. Then the entity had descended to Earth, and the disruption had grown. Each action the entity took, from casual destruction to combat with Darkseid, stressed reality in ways that accumulated like cracks in overstressed glass. The battle between Beerus and Darkseid had pushed those cracks toward the breaking point. Fate stood at the Tower of Fate, located simultaneously in Salem, Massachusetts, and in dimensions where geography was irrelevant. Around him, the tower's interior pulsed with golden light artifacts accumulated over millennia, resonating in response to the cosmic disturbance occurring 50 miles away. The helmet of Nabu fused to his head in symbiosis that transcended mere wearing, fed him information faster than mortal consciousness could process. Earth's dimensional stability was failing. The battle between two entities operating under incompatible cosmic frameworks was creating resonance effects that propagated through every layer of reality. If allowed to continue, the damage would become irreversible, not just to Metropolis or even Earth, but to the entire dimensional structure that made this universe possible. Intervention was required. And intervention would require collaboration from practitioners whose combined power might possibly be sufficient to contain forces that individually exceeded their capabilities. Fate reached out through channels that connected him to the mystical community. His consciousness touched Zatanna in her sanctum phantom stranger, walking the spaces between moments and the green's vast awareness that extended through every plant on Earth. The communication was instantaneous, bypassing conventional speech for direct transfer of understanding. They came immediately. Zatanna materialized in the tower through a portal that smelled of stage magic and genuine power intertwined. She was young by immortal standards, barely into her 4th decade. But her magical lineage extended through generations of practitioners who had shaped reality through backward speech and showmanship that concealed genuine mastery. Phantom Stranger simply appeared as if the concept of traveling from one location to another was too pedestrian for someone who existed partially outside causality. His face remained hidden in shadow despite the tower's omnidirectional lighting, and his presence carried the weight of mysteries too old for mortal comprehension. Swamp Thing took longer manifesting through the building's gardens, where Fate maintained specimens from across the world. The avatar of the green rose from soil that shouldn't have been able to support such rapid growth, bringing with it the attention of planetary consciousness that had existed since the first photosynthetic organisms developed billions of years ago. Fate wasted no time on explanation. His colleagues could perceive the situation as clearly as he could. Instead, he outlined the solution he had calculated during the microseconds between recognizing the crisis and summoning assistance. They would create a pocket dimension, a bubble of false reality layered over the battlefield, convincing both combatants they were still fighting in conventional space, while actually isolating them from Earth's physical structure. The technique was ancient, developed by practitioners who had needed to contain conflicts between gods without destroying the civilizations caught in the crossfire. The execution would require perfect synchronization and more power than any of them possessed individually. But combined, drawing on their different specializations and power sources, they might achieve sufficient force to succeed. Zatanna would handle the spatial manipulation using her backward speech to rewrite local geometry. Phantom Stranger would anchor the pocket dimension to moments between seconds, giving it temporal stability. Swamp Thing would connect it to the green, using planetary life force to sustain the construct, and Fate would weave everything together through the helmet's understanding of cosmic order, holding the disparate elements in coherent structure. They began immediately. Zatanna's voice echoed through the tower words spoken in reverse that made reality uncomfortable. Space folded according to linguistic commands that treated physics as a language to be edited rather than laws to be obeyed. The air around her rippled with distortions that hurt to observe directly. Phantom Stranger extended one hand, and time stuttered. Moments stretched and compressed, creating gaps in causality where the pocket dimension could be anchored. The effect was subtle, barely perceptible, but crucial for maintaining stability once the construct was deployed. Swamp Thing's consciousness expanded through the planetary network, drawing on life force from every plant within 1,000 miles. Trees contributed stored energy. Grass fields offered their collective vitality. Even microscopic algae added infinitesimal amounts to the gathering power. The green responded to its avatar's need with the patient inevitability of geological processes. Fate wove it all together, his consciousness operating across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The golden light radiating from his helmet intensified, illuminating patterns in space-time that existed below normal perception. Threads of cause and effect became visible, malleable, ready to be reshaped according to calculated necessity. The pocket dimension formed in the space above Metropolis, invisible to normal observation, but crystal clear to those with senses attuned to such things. It existed as a bubble approximately 2 miles in diameter, a perfect sphere of false reality that mimicked Earth's physical properties while remaining isolated from them. The mystics anchored it to the battlefield through connections too subtle for physical description. Then, working in perfect synchronization, they expanded it downward to encompass both Beerus and Darkseid. The transition was seamless. One moment the combatants stood on Earth's surface, their battle threatening planetary stability. The next, they occupied a space that looked identical, but existed separately, isolated from conventional reality, like a theatrical set divorced from the actual world. Beerus felt the shift immediately. His senses, honed through millions of years as a god of destruction, detected wrongness in the fundamental structure of space around him. The texture was incorrect. Energy propagation followed slightly different rules. And most tellingly, the responses he received from his destructive power felt muted, as if filtered through layers of interference. He stopped moving, his attention shifting from Darkseid to the space itself. His tail, previously rigid with annoyance, began swaying as his focus turned analytical. Someone was manipulating reality around him. The technique was sophisticated, well executed, probably representing significant effort from whoever had implemented it. It was also completely transparent to his divine perception. Beerus could see through the illusion as easily as seeing through glass. The pocket dimension existed as a construct artificial, and maintained separate from the genuine reality beneath. The mystics had created a convincing simulation, but simulation was all it was. His first reaction was a flicker of respect. The practitioners responsible for this had skill worth acknowledging. Creating stable pocket dimensions required understanding of cosmic structure that few beings achieved. That they had managed to deploy it around him without asking permission showed either courage or stupidity, possibly both. His second reaction was irritation that had nothing to do with the technique's quality and everything to do with its implications. They were trying to manage him, to contain him like a problem requiring isolation rather than a god deserving respect. The intention, however noble, represented fundamental disrespect for his nature and position. And Beerus had very little patience for disrespect. Across the false battlefield, Darkseid also recognized the dimensional shift. His analytical systems, while operating under different frameworks than Beerus's divine senses, achieved similar conclusions. They had been moved into constructed space, isolated from the genuine article. His response differed from Beerus's. Where the god of destruction felt insulted, Darkseid felt opportunity. A pocket dimension meant Earth's mystics considered the battle too dangerous for conventional space, which meant they feared the consequences, and fear could be exploited. He gathered Omega energy for another strike, intending to test whether the pocket dimension structure could withstand forces that had shattered genuine reality. The energy accumulated crimson light building toward critical mass. Beerus watched this preparation with decreasing interest. The fight had lost whatever entertainment value it once possessed. Darkseid was durable, certainly, but not threatening. The battle had stretched past the point where it provided amusement into territory where it simply consumed time Beerus would rather spend finding food. And now mystics were intervening, attempting to manipulate him through dimensional tricks that insulted his intelligence and patience in equal measure. He made a decision. He was done. Done with this battle, done with this planet, done with this universe's combination of inadequate service and presumptuous interference. If the mystics wanted him isolated, he would accommodate them by leaving entirely. But the manner of his departure would serve as lesson about the consequences of attempting to manage gods without permission. His energy signature, which had been climbing steadily toward extinction levels, suddenly stabilized, not decreasing, but achieving steady state at levels that made every magical practitioner within 100 miles feel their teeth ache. In the Tower of Fate, Zatanna felt the shift and recognized its implications immediately. He knows. He's figured out the pocket dimension. Fate's voice, filtered through the helmet's divine nature, carried certainty rather than concern. Awareness was inevitable. The question is whether he will remain contained long enough for the battle to conclude naturally, or force dissolution through direct assault. Phantom stranger. Observing from his position outside conventional time provided the answer they didn't want to hear. Neither. He's preparing to leave. Not through the pocket dimension's boundaries, but through his own method. The energy signature suggests dimensional transit on scales we cannot prevent. Swamp Thing's consciousness, distributed through planetary life, felt the green's response to Beerus's building power. Plants within 5 miles of Metropolis were entering dormancy, retreating from proximity to energy that threatened their fundamental existence. The planetary consciousness was pulling back, creating distance between itself and something it recognized as too dangerous for direct interaction. In the pocket dimension, Beerus raised one hand toward the sky. His destructive energy, normally leaking from his form in constant low-level discharge, gathered at his fingertips with focused intent. The purple-black sphere that formed there was larger than previous manifestations, approximately the size of a basketball rotating with motion that suggested it existed in more dimensions than the three visible ones. He wasn't aiming at Darkseid, wasn't targeting the pocket dimension's structure. Instead, he focused on the barrier between dimensions themselves, the fundamental separation that kept universes discrete and isolated. The sphere compressed became denser accumulated power that exceeded the yield of nuclear arsenals. When it achieved sufficient mass to accomplish what Beerus intended, he released it upward in a gesture that looked almost casual. The sphere rose through the pocket dimension's false sky, passed through its constructed boundaries without slowing, and struck the actual dimensional barrier that separated this universe from the void beyond. Reality screamed. The barrier designed by whatever cosmic forces had established this universe's fundamental laws was never meant to be breached from inside. It existed as absolute boundary, the definition of where this universe ended and others began. Attacking it from within was like trying to punch through the page you were drawn on. Beerus's destructive energy didn't care about metaphysical impossibilities. The barrier cracked. Not shattered, not destroyed, but damaged enough to create an opening approximately 10 feet in diameter. Through that opening, the void between universes became visible, a darkness so complete it made black seem bright by comparison. Beerus regarded his handiwork with the satisfaction of someone who had made their point effectively. Then, without looking back at Darkseid, or the ruined city, or the planet that had proven so disappointing, he flew upward through the crack he had created. His passage through the dimensional barrier took less than a second. One moment present in the pocket dimension, the next existing in the space between universes where normal physics surrendered to forces that predated reality itself. The crack began healing immediately, reality's self-repair mechanisms closing the wound at speeds that suggested universal immune response. Within 5 seconds, the barrier had sealed completely, leaving no trace that it had ever been breached. In the pocket dimension, Darkseid stood alone, his gathered Omega energy dissipating unused. His opponent had simply left, abandoning the battle without conclusion or ceremony. The anticlimax was almost insulting. The pocket dimension, no longer needed for containment, began to dissolve. The mystics who had created it carefully unraveled their work, returning the space to conventional reality. The transition was gentle controlled, ensuring that Darkseid's return to Earth's surface didn't generate additional destruction. When the dimensional barriers finally parted, Darkseid found himself standing in the ruins of Metropolis, exactly where the battle had begun. The destruction remained. The wounded planet remained. But the entity that had caused it all had departed, leaving only questions and the memory of power that operated on frameworks this universe didn't recognize. Above in the Watchtower, Batman's sensors confirmed what his tactical analysis had already concluded. The entity was gone. Departed from this universe entirely through methods that shouldn't have been possible, but demonstrably were. Threat level reduced from extinction to aftermath management. He activated the all-channels communication. Threat has departed. Begin damage assessment and long-term evacuation planning. This event is Code Omega. Prepare for potential return. Across the communication network, voices responded with variations of acknowledgement and relief. The immediate crisis was over. Earth had survived, though Metropolis had not. And somewhere in the space between universes, a god of destruction who had been interrupted during his nap continued his journey away from a reality that had proven more annoying than it was worth. The void between universes was a place that didn't technically exist. No space, no time, no matter, no energy, as conventional physics understood it. Just absence, pure and absolute stretching in directions that required more than 3 dimensions to properly describe. Beerus floated in that absence, his form the only point of reference in an infinity of nothing. His destructive energy, which normally leaked from him in constant discharge, was the brightest thing in this non-place providing illumination that had nothing to illuminate. He paused in his journey, hovering in the void, while his annoyance slowly settled back toward baseline levels. The universe he had just departed was already becoming memory, fading into the vast accumulation of experiences that filled millions of years of existence. It had been disappointing. That was the summary that crystallized in his mind. Similar enough to Universe 7 to trigger expectations different enough to frustrate them. The food had been inaccessible due to poor service and his own involuntary destruction. The inhabitants had been simultaneously too weak to provide entertainment and too persistent to ignore. And the entire experience had been colored by the fundamental wrongness of existing in a reality that didn't recognize his proper place in cosmic hierarchy. His tail swayed in the void, the motion conveying residual irritation. His clothing damage during the brief fight with Darkseid bothered him more than the fight itself. Finding replacement garments in the void between universes would be impossible, which meant he would need to manifest new ones through energy manipulation, which was tedious. He sighed the exhalation, creating a brief pulse of destructive energy that propagated outward into infinity. Somewhere in some distant reality, that pulse might encounter matter and erase it, or it might simply dissipate across distances too vast for meaningful interaction. Beerus didn't particularly care which. His attention turned to the question of where to go next. The void between universes theoretically connected to infinite realities, each with their own physical laws and cosmic structures. He could sense them vaguely as distant presences in the non-space around him. Some felt similar to Universe 7. Others radiated complete alienness. A few registered as actively hostile, their fundamental nature incompatible with his existence. The DC universe he had just departed was already sealed behind him, its dimensional barriers repaired and reinforced. Going back would require breaking through again, which was possible but pointless. He had already determined that reality had nothing worth the effort. Forward, then. Or what passed for forward in a place without directions. Beerus oriented himself toward a distant presence that felt marginally promising. The energy signature suggested a universe with active divine structures, which meant it might possess proper cosmic hierarchy and, more importantly, civilizations that understood how to treat visiting gods with appropriate respect. He began moving his velocity, increasing from stillness to speeds that made light seem stationary. The void offered no resistance, no friction, no obstacles. Just infinite emptiness crossed at infinite speed. Behind him in the universe, he had abandoned the aftermath of his visit, was just beginning to be understood. In Metropolis, the pocket dimension's dissolution had returned Darkseid to conventional space, without fanfare. The new god stood in the center of the destruction, his stone skin still showing cracks from Beerus's strikes, his omega energy dissipated and requiring time to rebuild. He surveyed the ruins with expression that suggested neither satisfaction nor disappointment. The battle had provided data worth the expenditure of avatar resources. The entity called Beerus operated on principles that exceeded Darkseid's current understanding. But understanding could be acquired through analysis and study. The entity had departed, which eliminated immediate threat, but created strategic uncertainty. Beings capable of breaching dimensional barriers from inside could return at will, making them unpredictable variables in any long-term planning. Darkseid filed this information away in consciousness that had cataloged thousands of similar encounters. Beerus was now classified as Cosmic Level Threat Origin. Unknown capabilities exceeding standard divine hierarchy, motivations unclear status departed, but potentially returnable. He activated his boom tube, the portal opening, with characteristic thunder, despite the reduced energy reserves. His avatar body needed repair, and the damage assessment would require consultation with Apocalypse's scientific divisions. But the fundamental conclusion was already clear. This universe contained entities from beyond its boundaries who possessed power that rivaled or exceeded the local cosmic hierarchy. That information had value worth the cost of a damaged avatar and the temporary humiliation of being dismissed as insufficiently interesting. Darkseid stepped through the boom tube, returning to Apocalypse with data that would occupy his analysts for months. Behind him, Metropolis fell silent, except for the distant sounds of emergency response and the settling debris. Superman descended from his observation position, landing in the crater that had been Fifth Avenue, with the heaviness of someone who had witnessed something beyond his capacity to prevent. His cape, normally pristine, was singed at the edges from proximity to energies that had pushed the boundaries of even Kryptonian durability. Wonder Woman joined him moments later, her armor showing new dents, but her injuries already healed through Amazon resilience. Flash arrived in a streak of lightning, his expression carrying the shock of someone who had processed the entire event at super speed and still couldn't quite believe it. They stood together in the ruins, three of Earth's most powerful defenders, and contemplated their complete inadequacy in the face of what they had just witnessed. Superman broke the silence, his voice carrying fatigue that transcended physical exhaustion. "We need to update the threat assessment protocols. Whatever that was, it's beyond anything in our current framework." Wonder Woman nodded, her ancient eyes reflecting the weight of centuries spent protecting humanity from gods and monsters. It was divine. But not from any pantheon I recognize. The energy signature felt older, more fundamental, as if destruction wasn't a tool, but an essential nature. Flash, still vibrating slightly as his metabolism processed the adrenaline, added his own observation. The speed. When it moved seriously, not the casual stuff, but actual combat movement, it was operating at velocities I could barely track. And I run fast enough to see quantum fluctuations. Above them, the Watchtower's communication channel carried Batman's voice, analytical, despite the circumstances. Confirmed. Entity departed through self-generated dimensional breach. The Mystics report barrier has self-sealed, but the fact that it could be breached from inside represents fundamental security vulnerability. Dr. Fate recommends dimensional reinforcement protocols. Implementation timeline unknown. Superman activated his communicator, addressing the entire Justice League network. "This is a Code Black incident. Full documentation required. Every sensor reading, every observation, every tactical assessment. If it comes back, we need to be prepared with something better than what we had today." The responses came in from League members across the globe and beyond. Acknowledgement. Agreement. And underlying it all, the recognition that today had revealed a gap in Earth's defenses that conventional preparation might never fill. In the Tower of Fate, the Mystics who had created the pocket dimension were experiencing their own reckoning. The technique had worked technically. They had successfully isolated the combatants and prevented their battle from destroying Earth's physical structure. But the ease with which Beerus had seen through the illusion, combined with his casual breach of dimensional barriers, suggested that their intervention had been tolerated rather than effective. He had left because he chose to not, because they had forced or convinced him. Zatanna, removing the strain of maintaining her portion of the spell, sat heavily in a chair that materialized to catch her. Her backward speech had rewritten reality for nearly 10 minutes, an effort that left her magically depleted and physically exhausted. We bought time, that's all. If he'd wanted to stay, or if he'd been actually angry instead of just annoyed, I'm not sure anything we did would have mattered. Dr. Fate, the helmet's golden light dimming as Naboo's full attention withdrew, didn't contradict her assessment. Accurate. The entity's power operates on scales that exceed our combined capabilities. We were fortunate that its motivation was departure rather than destruction. Phantom Stranger, who had remained standing throughout the effort, offered the observation that none of them wanted to hear, but all of them needed to acknowledge. It may return. Entities that can breach dimensional barriers are not constrained by the usual protections. Earth must prepare for the possibility of future visitation. But a Swamp Thing, its avatar beginning to dissolve back into the Green's planetary network, provided the most disturbing insight. The Green remembers. The planetary consciousness has recorded this entity's energy signature. If it returns, we will know immediately. But knowing and preventing are different capabilities. The mystics dispersed, each returning to their own sanctums and responsibilities, carrying with them the knowledge that Earth's mystical defenses had proven insufficient against forces from beyond the multiverse. In the ruins of Metropolis, cleanup crews were beginning to arrive, their vehicles navigating through streets clogged with debris. The immediate death toll was surprisingly low, thanks to the evacuation protocols and the fact that Beerus's destruction had been focused rather than widespread. But the property damage, measured in billions of dollars, and the psychological impact on a city that had just witnessed cosmic entities fighting in its streets, would take years to process. News helicopters circled at safe distance, their cameras capturing footage that would dominate global media for weeks. The images were surreal, a perfect hemispherical crater where downtown buildings had stood, shattered structures radiating outward from ground zero. And in the center of it all, the Justice League standing in poses that suggested victory only to those who didn't understand what they had actually witnessed. Batman, coordinating from the Watchtower, was already preparing the official statement. Unknown extraterrestrial entity. Threat neutralized through combined Justice League and mystical community action. Entity departed Earth voluntarily. Danger passed. All of which was technically true, while obscuring the fundamental reality that Earth had survived through luck rather than capability. In the White House Situation Room, the President and his advisors were receiving briefings from the Department of Extra-Normal Operations and Haid E. The consensus was forming around a conclusion that no one wanted to state explicitly if that entity returned with hostile intent. Conventional defense and even Justice League intervention would be insufficient. Contingency plans were being drafted, evacuation protocols updated, early warning systems calibrated to detect dimensional breaches, all of it representing humanity's attempt to prepare for threats that exceeded the frameworks they had developed for more conventional dangers. And across the world, in laboratories and research facilities and secret installations, scientists were analyzing the sensor data from Beerus's visit. The energy signatures, the physical effects, the way his presence had warped space-time and violated conservation laws. Some of that data would lead to breakthroughs in physics and dimensional theory. Some would generate new weapon systems and defense technologies. And some would simply sit in classified files too dangerous to study and too important to destroy, waiting for the day when the entity might return and humanity needed every possible advantage. In the void between universes, Beerus crossed distances that made intergalactic space seem intimate. His journey carried him away from the DC universe, away from Earth and its disappointing restaurants and presumptuous mystics. His annoyance was fading, settling back into the baseline irritation that characterized his normal state. The interrupted sleep still bothered him. The damaged clothing still needed replacement. And he was still hungry, having failed to obtain even a single meal, despite descending to a planet specifically for that purpose. But these were minor inconveniences, easily resolved once he found a universe that actually deserved his attention. His tail swayed in the void, the motion conveying residual displeasure. Behind him, the DC universe continued its existence, marked now by the brief passage of a god of destruction who had visited, found it wanting, and departed without ceremony. The encounter would be remembered, studied, analyzed, feared. But for Beerus, it was already becoming just another disappointment in a long existence filled with them. Somewhere ahead, in the infinite possibilities of the multiverse, there had to be a universe with decent food and competent service. He would keep looking until he found it. 3 days after the incident, Batman sat in the Watchtower's secure documentation chamber, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every recorded second of Beerus's visit to Earth. The chamber was designed for exactly this purpose: comprehensive analysis of threats that exceeded standard protocols. The displays cycled through sensor data energy readings, tactical observations, and eyewitness accounts. Each loop revealed new details that his analytical mind cataloged and cross-referenced. The entity's arrival, the restaurant incident, the battle with Darkseid, the departure through self-generated dimensional breach. All of it added up to a conclusion that made every threat assessment protocol he had developed over the past decade seem inadequate. Batman had spent his adult life preparing for impossible situations. He maintained contingency plans for rogue Justice League members, alien invasions, dimensional incursions, and at least 47 other scenarios that most people would dismiss as paranoid fantasy. His files contained strategies for defeating Superman, containing Wonder Woman neutralizing Flash, and managing every other superpowered individual who might theoretically become a threat. None of those plans would have worked against Beerus. The entity had demonstrated casual destruction capability that exceeded nuclear arsenals, had engaged Darkseid's avatar in combat and emerged clearly superior, had detected and seen through mystical intervention that represented the combined effort of Earth's most powerful practitioners, and had departed by simply breaking through dimensional barriers from inside, accomplishing something that should have been physically impossible. More concerning than the power was the motivation. Beerus hadn't come to conquer or destroy or acquire resources. He had been looking for food. The entire incident, from arrival to departure, had been driven by something as mundane as hunger and annoyance at poor service. That made him unpredictable in ways that conventional threats weren't. Strategic enemies could be anticipated through analysis of their goals. Beerus's goals appeared to be find decent food and don't be annoyed, neither of which provided useful framework for defensive planning. Batman began compiling the official file, the document that would serve as primary reference for all future encounters with the entity if it returned. The file required a classification code. Standard threat categories ranged from Alpha Enhanced Human to Omega Reality Threatening. Beerus exceeded Omega. Batman created a new category, Omega Plus, reserved for entities that operated beyond conventional universal frameworks. Next came the designation. The entity had been called Beerus in preliminary reports, though the source of that name remained unclear. Possibly self-identification during interactions that hadn't been fully documented. Possibly derived from other means. Batman filed it as primary designation with a note that verification was incomplete. The capabilities section took longer. Batman listed everything observed, everything inferred, and everything that remained unknown. Destructive energy projection at planetary scale. Faster than light travel. Dimensional breach from inside universal boundaries. Combat capability exceeding known divine entities. Sensory capacity sufficient to detect dimensional manipulation. Durability sufficient to withstand Omega effect. Physical strength exceeding multi-ton threshold by unknown factor. and motivations that appeared to center on cuisine and respect. The threat assessment required careful wording. Too alarming, and it would cause panic. Too understated, and it would fail to convey the genuine danger. Batman settled on language that was accurate while remaining measured. Entity demonstrates capability to destroy Earth through casual action. Departure was voluntary rather than forced. No known defensive measures sufficient to prevent return or ensure favorable outcome unless entity arrives with hostile intent. Recommend immediate alert protocols if dimensional sensors detect similar energy signature. Engagement not advised under any circumstances without explicit approval from Justice League leadership and mystical community consensus. The final section covered response protocols. Batman outlined a multi-stage plan that balanced the need for preparation against the reality that preparation might be futile. Stage 1 early warning. Sensors monitoring dimensional barriers calibrated to detect energy signatures matching Beerus's profile. Alert time potentially minutes before arrival. Stage 2 diplomatic approach. If entity returns, attempt communication before any defensive action. Priority goals determine motivation. Offer assistance with stated objectives. Avoid provocation. Stage 3. Evacuation. If diplomatic approach fails, implement global evacuation protocols. Population centers within 500 miles of entity's position to be evacuated within 30 minutes. Secondary evacuation expanding to continental scale if entity demonstrates hostile intent. Stage 4. Mystical intervention. Dr. Fate authorized to implement containment protocols without requiring approval delays. Priority: protect Earth's physical integrity over containment effectiveness. Stage 5. Threshold determination. If all previous stages fail and Earth faces imminent destruction, Justice League leadership authorized to implement final protocols. Details classified beyond this document's security level. Batman reviewed the file 3 times, making minor adjustments to language and ensuring every section was both accurate and actionable. When he was satisfied, he assigned it the highest security classification and uploaded it to the Justice League's secure servers. The file appeared in the database with designation Beerus 001. Status departed. Threat level Omega+. Engagement protocol: avoid unless unavoidable. In the Watchtower's observation deck, Superman stood looking at Earth through windows that could withstand nuclear explosions. The planet rotated beneath him, showing no visible evidence of the crisis it had survived. From orbit, Metropolis appeared as lights and structures, the damage invisible at this scale. He had spent 3 days helping with cleanup operations, moving debris, stabilizing damaged buildings, providing assistance to emergency services overwhelmed by the scope of destruction. Physical labor that his Kryptonian physiology could sustain indefinitely without fatigue. But the psychological weight was something his powers couldn't lift. He had been utterly inadequate. Not just insufficient, but completely irrelevant to the actual outcome. The entity had scattered him like a leaf in a hurricane, and his return to the battlefield had been pointless because the situation had resolved without his involvement. Earth's survival had depended on the entity choosing to leave, rather than on anything its defenders had accomplished. Wonder Woman joined him at the window, her presence announced by the soft sound of boots on metal deck plating. She stood beside him in silence for several moments before speaking. "You're wondering if we matter at all. If entities like that can arrive without warning and leave without consequence, what purpose does the Justice League serve?" Superman nodded, trusting her centuries of experience to have encountered similar thoughts. "I'm supposed to protect Earth. That's the whole point. And against something like Beerus, I couldn't do anything that mattered." Diana's expression carried understanding, earned through longer experience with divine encounters than Superman's relatively brief, heroic career. "We protect against the threats we can stop." Beerus represents something beyond that category. His departure was fortune, not victory. But fortune counts, and our actions may have influenced his choice to leave peacefully rather than destructively. May have. Superman repeated the words, carrying doubt. May have, Diana confirmed. Certainty is rare when dealing with gods. But consider the evacuation saved lives. The mystical intervention contained the battle's scope. Batman's analysis will prepare us better for future encounters. These actions had value, even if they didn't achieve traditional victory. And Superman considered this, his expression gradually shifting from despair towards something approaching acceptance. So we prepare for what we can handle, and hope that the impossible threats remain disinterested in Earth. We prepare, Diana agreed, and we adapt. The universe has shown us there are entities beyond our current capability. That knowledge is itself valuable. It prevents complacency and drives us to become stronger, better, more prepared for whatever comes next. In the documentation chamber, Batman completed his final task, updating the Watchtower's threat response matrix. The system, designed to provide immediate tactical recommendations based on sensor readings, now included protocols for Beerus-level entities. If similar energy signatures were detected, avoid engagement, attempt communication, prepare evacuation, notify mystical community, do not provoke. The protocols were inadequate. Batman knew this, but inadequate preparation was still superior to no preparation, and these guidelines might save lives if similar entities arrived in the future. He stood from the console, his work complete for now. The documentation would continue as teams analyzed the sensor data and scientists studied the physical effects. But the core assessment was done, filed, and available for reference. Batman activated the communication channel that reached every Justice League member simultaneously. Beerus file is complete and uploaded. All members should review within 48 hours. Questions and additional observations should be submitted to the secure database. This concludes immediate response to the Metropolis incident. Acknowledgements came in from around the globe and beyond. The team understood the implications, had seen the footage, knew what it meant for Earth's security going forward. In the void between universes, Beerus had crossed distances that made intergalactic space seem intimate. His journey had carried him through non-space where conventional physics surrendered to forces that predated reality itself. He had sensed other universes, considered them, and rejected them as either too similar to the one he had just left, or too alien for comfortable visitation. Finally, after what might have been hours or days or no time at all in a place where time was negotiable, he detected something promising. A universe whose energy signature suggested proper cosmic hierarchy. Divine structures that operated under rules he recognized. And potentially civilizations that understood how to prepare food without spilling it on visiting deities. Beerus adjusted his trajectory, angling toward this new reality. His damaged clothing had been replaced through energy manipulation, manifesting garments identical to what he had worn before. His hunger, while not urgent, provided motivation to investigate this new option sooner rather than later. He approached the dimensional barrier of this promising universe, preparing to breach it with the same casual efficiency he had used to depart the DC reality. Behind him, in the multiverse's infinite expanse, the DC universe continued its existence. Earth rotated around its sun. Metropolis rebuilt. The Justice League prepared. And in classified files, accessible only to those with highest clearance, Beerus's visit was documented as the day Earth learned it existed in a multiverse where divine entities could arrive without warning and leave without consequence. the planet would remember, would prepare, would hope that if Beerus returned, it would be during a time when the restaurants were open and the service was adequate. In the Watchtower, Batman archived the file and moved on to the next crisis requiring attention. Behind him, the holographic displays cycled through their endless documentation, recording every detail of an encounter that had lasted less than 2 hours but would influence Earth's security protocols for decades to come. The displays showed a purple figure standing in ruins, showed energy readings that exceeded measurement scales, showed the moment of departure when the entity simply tore through reality and left. And in the file's final notation, Batman had added a single line that summarized the most important lesson learned. Entity departed through boredom rather than defeat. This constitutes Earth's survival strategy be too uninteresting to destroy. It was Batman reflected the strangest victory condition he had ever documented. But survival counted as victory regardless of how it was achieved. Earth had survived Beerus. That would have to be enough. In the void between universes, Beerus breached the dimensional barrier of his next destination, passing through into a new reality that hopefully contained better restaurants than the last one. His tail swayed with anticipation. Perhaps this universe would have pudding.